Hey, Matthew, good morning.
Good morning, Alex.
I think this might be an internet first. Here we have a cybersecurity professor and an online voting company, the head of an online voting company coming together, sitting down to talk about, what are we going to do next? I mean, last week we had an insurrection in the United States at the Capitol. Yesterday we had a president who was impeached for the second time. And today here in Ontario, this morning we've come under a stay-at-home order from COVID-19. Things are in rough shape right now, kind of across the Western world. Where do we go from here?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I think that's the nature of this discussion, is to sort of have a meeting of the minds and see what we're all taking away from our various, disciplines. From what I've seen, as a politically neutral company, what happened in the U.S., of course, is a very tragic event for democracy, not just, from a partisan basis, but to have a verified election, a certified election now, continually called into question, I think is one of the worst case scenarios. And it's something that I know that you've been speaking about for a number of years. Like, what happens when a candidate simply says it's wrong? What do we do? And it's really interesting to see how the public is disseminating this. And I think, that this is a very unique American context of what's happening down there, but I don't think Canada is, to use the term, vaccinated against something like this happening up here as well.
Well, maybe yes, maybe no. So fortunately for Canada, our political system and our electoral system is extremely different than the United States. When I was a kid, I used to think that the United States and Canada were basically almost the same. Yes, they broke off from, the crown, and we stayed loyal to the crown, and there's sort of like kind of a smaller difference in the 20th century context. But the older I get, the more I realize that our institutions really do shape our society, and our institutions are actually different than the United States. The way we run elections is different. I mean, you can kind of get into like which, what you like and don't like about each institution and each approach to elections. Of course, the US has a different approach depending on which county you're in. So there's no like US approach exactly. But yeah, we're in a rough place right now. And, you mentioned about how I've kind of been sort of, kind of active speaking kind of publicly about, well before anybody in the US was concerned about the 2020 presidential election. There was this concern of, okay, well, if you're going to use election technology that is not verifiable, or at least doesn't provide any evidentiary substance or trail or anything, then what happens when a candidate challenges that election? Now, in my mind, what I was envisioning was somebody with a leg to stand on questioning the election, somebody who actually lost and had reason to believe they lost. I wasn't anticipating maybe a bad faith effort to repeat something that was never, there was never any basis for the president to claim the fraud. And to me, the evidence for that claim, kind of comes from the fact that the specter of fraud was being raised in March before the election. So like that to me was like, look, we are going to raise the fraud issue if we don't get the outcome we want. And, going all the way back to the beginning of that political movement with, the whole birther thing, just these like untruths that are, just like easily dealt with in a sort of a trust-based society where you can say, oh yeah, yeah, that document sure kind of puts that to rest. The approach has been, well, if it's not the result I want, I will just keep saying that it was rigged enough times until I believe it and other people around me believe it. And I mean, I guess, when we when, you know, at least in the academic literature, you know, we always talk about the adversary in the abstract. And this is a very concrete, very, very specific, very unique to the US context, adversarial action. And I just want to be clear for anybody that is watching this, that you know, nobody that I know in the United States that knows anything about how elections work, that is to say, had an interest in elections before the president started tweeting about mail-in voting in March. All of the people in my community have been active since, you know, since Florida 2000 with trying to make elections verifiable. And they have, you know, they've had roadblocks at every turn. And so, you know, every year it gets a little bit better. And when somebody like Chris Krebs gets up and says this was the most secure election in American history, it kind of was. I mean, I mean, it wasn't perfect, and there were still things that needed to get fixed. But you know, you should have seen the way the U.S. looked. You know, like even in the previous election or the election before that. You know, I had a colleague from the U.S. give me an old decertified U.S. voting machine that had been used in the 2015. You know, in an election in 2015, and that thing was running unpatched Windows XP. You know, from like,
what was it, a deep bold machine?
No, it was Winvote. And so my colleagues in the U.S. Some of them called it the sort of the most insecure machine in sort of the world for counting votes, and in many ways you could agree with that. I mean, like the Wi-Fi had a password of like ABCD, and there was no administrative password, and it had like it had Internet Explorer installed on it, so we actually even were able to get it to connect to the internet and surf web pages. Like with a U.S. voting machine, okay? I mean, so, you know, this is where they were coming from. And through efforts of, you know, NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the EAC, and just the thought leadership that exists in the United States, they've been pulling themselves out of this kind of world of unverifiable voting. And now they actually kind of know how to do it. And they've actually got a lot of states to do it the best way the best way they can. So, you know, all of the U.S. People that I know, they're like, you know, we're not seeing anything here. In fact, we see a lot of evidence to the contrary, a lot of evidence to support the idea that the election was counted correctly. And oh, by the way, we have this evidentiary trail in the form of a paper ballot. It's not the only evidentiary trail that you could imagine, and we're going to talk about that. But you know, okay, maybe there was you know, some issues surrounding mail-in voting and how do you verify identity. We need to separate. It's a very big difference, right? You know, as somebody in the community of election integrity people, it's not like I haven't criticized electoral practices. I mean, I absolutely do. But the difference is that when the votes get counted, I shut up, right? You know, it's like you can criticize the process leading up to the election. And when the votes are counted and the results are declared, you got to shut your mouth, right? Because like, what are you going to do? Like, what are you doing after that point? You like, there's one thing to criticize the process, but to criticize the result itself, especially without anything in your hand, like you got to read these lawsuits. Like, I mean, so the lawsuit, I mean, I think there's been well over 50 filed in like almost every state. They've all been thrown out, I think, except for one. And I mean, they're lazy. They're just lazy. One of the lawsuits that I read had 2 spelling mistakes in the title. You know,
I think though there's a big difference, and something that needs to be identified though, and is been very clear in the U.S. is there's the courts where this litigation was or these lawsuits were put forward, but then there's the court of public opinion, and what you're seeing right now is that the court of public opinion can weigh just as heavily as the civil courts. So yeah, they claimed a bunch of things. They were all shot down except for I think that one which involved the amount of space a person could stand in proximity to a recount. But the idea that people now inherently distrust the voting system is paramount. Like that's what has emerged from all of this. And I remember listening to you talk about this stuff 2 years ago or something. Like what happens when a candidate claims that it was fraudulent, and in the context that you were speaking about it, it was, oh, what if we need to prove what you just mentioned about verifiability or verify the election results? But in the absence of any verifiability, without anything, even if you have the paper ballot trail, if a candidate simply rejects the evidence outright, you have what has emerged in the US, which is this, I don't want to use the word conspiracy, but just inherent distrust in the system itself right now. What do we do moving forward now? Is like, how do you rebuild that trust back into a voting process?
So let me tell you a story about what happened, what I saw here in Ontario in 2018 with some of the elections that happened. These are municipal elections. So, it's like small town Ontario, which is obviously a very far cry from, federal US politics in terms of its tone and the issues. But it's still an election, and it's still people battling it out politically to sort of control. And people like to sort of look at municipal politics as being kind of like just this sort of like minor thing. But, you have to think about it from the perspective of the municipal politicians. Like, bylaws have probably the most impact on your day-to-day life about what you're allowed to do, and what your neighbors do around you and what they're allowed to do around you. It really affects your life. Do you have a bylaw that says that your neighbor can install a security camera and point it into your house, right? Or is there bylaw to prevent that? So municipal politics is actually like a fairly important part of our lives. And certainly there's millions of dollars in land development deals that are at stake, and municipal politics can get pretty rough. I've seen a lot of that back and forth. I'd say it's a little bit more rough and tumble than some of the federal Canadian politics that I've witnessed. But the point is that when they had their municipal elections in 2018 here in Ontario, there were people who were genuinely they couldn't explain why they lost. It didn't add up to them. Now, did something go wrong? Was the election rigged? Well, none of us saw any evidence that it was rigged. And even they acknowledged that they couldn't find any smoking guns. But to distinguish what happened in the US from what happened here is that they couldn't get any evidence to kind of put down this suspicion that they had. And it wasn't their concern didn't really, I wouldn't say it wasn't a bad faith concern. If anything, it was a good faith concern. And the evidence for that is that a lot of the, these are like former mayors, former councillors that I talked to. I said, look, what are you going to do about this? Are you going to challenge this in court? Are you going to take this to the papers? Like, what are you going to do? And they all said, I'm not going to do anything because even though I think I'm right, I can't really make a case. And all that would happen is I would damage my community. One of the counselors used the term sour grapes. And that's a term that, we use in when somebody loses and they like clearly lost, but they don't want to concede. And they said, I don't think that I have sour grapes, but I don't want to project the image that I have sour grapes. And so this was a concern where there were these people walking around who just, maybe it's a more kind of Canadian way to do things, just to sort of quietly just go about your business. One of the counselors I talked to, she was just heartbroken over what happened. She thinks something went wrong, but again, she couldn't figure out what to do about it. So she said, you know what? I'm going to take a vacation. I'm going to go somewhere warm. This was back before COVID. And I'm just going to move on with my life. And, in some cases, we were actually involved in some efforts to try to get information out of some of these municipalities about what happened. And there were some freedom of information requests and so forth. And we couldn't get, we never got any of the evidence, right? So we don't know what happened. So we're just running these elections and we don't really know like if they were legit. I mean, we assume that they were legit, but like, why should we be in a position where we just have to trust the system, right? Maybe.
Well, let me ask you, with your, you're familiar with computer science, infrastructure, how systems are designed. What evidence would they have been able to provide using a software-based approach? Like realistically, like what would have satisfied your concern from a disclosure? Would handing over the source code, handing over the logs, like what would have set, if you could have this utopian disclosure package sent over to you?
Yeah.
Would there have been anything? Well, let me ask you another further question, because I know this is sort of rhetorical, but if they had handed over like 2 million lines of source code and whatever logs were produced in the election, how long would it have taken you to go through that with a fine-tooth comb to figure out if anything did even happen?
Well, the answer is infinity. It would take me infinite time because I could spend infinitely many hours looking at that code and still not be able to tell. I think the thing that I wish that was understood in Ontario, it's understood in the United States, right? Like my colleagues in the US like understand this, and they have worked for years to build laws and to build standards to deal with this. But it is not understood, or at least not being kind of considered here in at least in Ontario, is that we are not interested in proving that the software doesn't have any bugs in it. We're interested in proving the results of the election are correct. That's what we care. I don't care about the software. I mean, I care about it insofar as I care about the election results. I want the election to be fair and democratic. That's all I want. And so if there was like, if you give me an internet system that can do that, then I don't have an objection to that. I mean, I think a lot of the Ontario municipal clerks probably have this view that I'm sort of anti-internet voting. I'm not. I'm anti-unverifiable voting, and you know what? Like everyone else is too. At least everyone that is sort of interested in the democratic. I mean, just the democratic principles that we apply in our elections are kind of universal. Like I mean, there's international agreements on what an election should look like. And so, I mean, it's tempting to think that, it just comes down to the laws. But I mean, there's certain principles like ballot secrecy and one person, one vote and all this kind of stuff. So if you got a system that has been designed with those principles in mind and actually can convince like honest observers, like good faith actors, that they've done something to assure these principles are upheld, then there's not an objection. The objection comes when they just build something. They don't think that, like, they probably don't. I mean, in some cases, I don't even know if they've actually thought about how what the system is doing matches up with the principles. I mean, the principles are all there in case, like in the case of Ontario municipalities, they're all there in case law. And so I'll say, look, here are the principles, here are the democratic principles that the law says that you have to uphold, and here's the system that you're using. Now tell me how this system matches up to this principle. And in many cases, that's when the kind of conversation ends, and it kind of becomes uncomfortable because they're not connecting those dots, and we got to connect those dots. Otherwise, we can't have elections without problems. And I mean, you're right. What we saw in the U.S. was, well, I don't know if it was the worst case. I can imagine worse or more worsely cases.
Yeah, true.
It was pretty bad. It was certainly a low point, a local minimum in terms of election.
I think something to consider moving forward, though, like what we're all taking away, like that's the nature of this discussion. Like we were chatting and we decided to sort of publicly talk about, because we have these discussions about what is the nature of security and integrity in an election. And what I've seen now over the last little bit in dealing with the clerks, speaking to them one-on-one, You know, security has historically never been a major factor. It has been a critical factor, but not one of the major ones. Ease of use is typically preferred because they want to simplify it, because elections are very difficult things to orchestrate. In fact, I was talking to a client down in Virginia yesterday, and who is running a school board election, something simple, like a maximum, I think, of 20,000 potential voters, super, you know, low stake. There's no parties, there's no anything. It was very simple to put this thing together. And he said, it is a nightmare. I wish they had a candidate who was running uncontested, and he was hoping that that continues. He's like, I hope no one else runs against him, because it would make my life so much easier. And the amount of effort that was going into simply having a school board election for an uncontested candidate was enormous. And during COVID, when they were running this last year, they had a vote by mail initiative they rolled out. And he said, even something like that, it's just the amount of logistics and complexity is enormous for simple elections. I can only imagine. And I have a great respect for Elections Canada for rolling out this pen and paper system as they've done for the last 100-something years now. But I think seeing what we saw in the US, I think everyone's kind of looking at this a little bit more solemnly now, and looking and saying, what happens if this comes up here? I know historically there.
You know, like I did a panel discussion recently at an Ontario municipality, and this was after the US presidential election had sort of concluded. And it was sort of at the like early days where it was like, oh, you know, there's all these baseless, bad faith election. I mean, I will use the word conspiracy, because I think that is, I think that in like an honest accounting of what that was, I think it is fair to call it a conspiracy, because it's just not something that is supported. I mean, none of us in the community have seen anything to suggest that. Like, here's the thing that these folks need to understand, is that the election integrity community, which I'm sort of a part of, if we had any indication that something like was seriously wrong, we would be right there with you, like screaming from the rooftop. I mean, there's no way that we would sit by and allow. I mean, that's like why, like, this is the thing that bothers me. You know, I've been working in this field since, like, I don't know, like late 2006, and then all of a sudden in March, you know, of 2020, I have people coming up to me, you know, friends and family and other colleagues and stuff like that, you know, people at the university, and, you know, telling me about mail-in voting. You know, they're like, oh, did you know the mail-in voting, whatever. And I'm like, who are you talking to here? I mean, come on. So, I mean, we would be right there, right? If we thought there was an issue. But here's the thing, you know, the thing that makes me really frustrated is that, you know, there's no internal self-diagnostic that's being run by people that are sort of forwarding this viewpoint, right? Like, if I was going to believe in a conspiracy, I would have to I would owe it to myself to work it through. So, for example, let's say that I was, I got it in my mind that I didn't believe the moon landings ever happened. Okay. But then I'm like, okay, well, first of all, why do I think that? Why do I believe that? Right. So sort of explore that question. But then I think that, you know, it would help to actually know something about, if you didn't believe the Apollo missions happened, at least understand what is being claimed about what happened, and then identify what it is you don't agree with. So when when I've talked to people that think that the moon landings were a hoax, I'm like, okay, which Apollo mission did not happen? Like, I mean, you know, so first of all, can you name which Apollo missions are at least alleged to have landed on the moon? And you know, and in many cases they just can't. Because they haven't actually read about it. They just want to believe. It's kind of like X-Files. I want to believe, you know, okay, fine. You want to believe, but do your homework, for goodness sakes. Like, understand where it is. What is the moment that what happened, what NASA actually did, diverges in your mind? Like, where, like, you know, did Apollo 8, you know, go around the, I mean, did the astronauts orbit the moon? Is that the part that's too far for you? Did they get into Earth orbit? Like, where's the point where you're like, no, that didn't happen, right? And you're not seeing the same thing happen. You're seeing something similar happen here, which is like, well, there was fraud. Oh, there was a thing. There was this. There was, there was an irregularity. People that are, I think, listen, if anybody is watching this and they are concerned that the election was stolen, ask yourself, first of all, do you know how the jurisdiction first of all, which jurisdiction are you saying? Because they're all like kind of different. Do you know how they do things in that jurisdiction? Do you know how they count votes? Do you know what a risk limiting audit is? Like, do you know have you ever worked a poll? If you've never even worked in an election, like I've worked in an election and I mean, they're messy. I mean, like a conventional paper pencil, federal, provincial, they are messy and things happen. And, there's like, there always are like little irregularities. And things do get like testy sometimes. I mean, Canadian elections are pretty sleepy, which, I think is a feature, of an election, is to be kind of quiet and not, dramatic. But you got to work it through. It's not enough to just claim that there was fraud. I mean, if you're just claiming that there's fraud, you're doing damage to our society, and you've got to stop. At least work it through.
But think about how these what you'd call a conspiracy came to fruition, though. So from a vendor's perspective, but I think there's a lot of elements. Nothing exists in a vacuum, right? Like there's all these elements that lead up to something. And like, coming from someone who's been critical of election systems, like you said, for 14 years now, I understand where they're coming from, though, because think about it. A year ago, 2019, a movie called Kill Chain came out on HBO that talked about how unsecure the voting systems are. You just talked about that earlier in this conversation. So leading up to this election, these systems were already being challenged and scrutinized and contested, and by people like yourself saying, we can't do this. I spoke to a colleague who hacked a system in another country, and then in the on Twitter, this was years ago, and then all of a sudden on Twitter, his paper claiming that this system was hacked is now circulating again because people are finding this stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody was citing your material as evidence that the election can't be trusted. So
I had to, yeah,
all
no,
of
I
a
had
sudden,
to,
this
yeah, no, I
did
had
that
to
actually
turn
happen?
down.
Did somebody use you?
Well, I mean, I had to turn down interviews from news outlets that were clearly trafficking in these conspiracies. And they say, oh, well,
Yeah.
we've seen that you've been critical. But again, right, what's the difference? Is there a difference? Yes, there is a difference. And it's a fundamental difference. It's one thing to criticize the process and say that this could lead to fraud, this could lead to hacking, this could lead to something, and then actually say this result was rigged. I mean, again, just work it out. Have you noticed how the bulk of this has focused on one race? If you look at a US ballot, there's many races on it. There's dozens, right? So like a ballot might have like 50 races on it. So are you like only one of them was rigged? They were all run through the same machines that were being alleged to, like, the worst conspiracies are alleging that like there was malicious fraud where a particular company wrote software to switch the votes. And it's like, okay, so like if we're going to assume that happened, like they only switched the presidential race, like you're only going after that one thing. Well, why is that? Well, it's because the person who had the interest in that election was out there repeating the narrative over and over until people started to believe it. I mean, that's what happened here. You were talking about like so HBO Kill Chain. So I know a lot of the people that were in that documentary, and the thing is that like as far as I can tell, actually knowing them and meeting them in person and talking to them, so they're all doing this in good faith, and it's not about it's not a political critique. It's not coming from a place of politics. It's coming from a place of democratic concern, and it's also abstract. All right, what we're seeing now is a kind of like kind of like a retcon. We're trying to like fit what we want to take the reality that happened. We want to backtrack it to what we want to have happen. And that's where the difference lies, right? So, you know, if your candidate loses and all of a sudden you're interested, now all of a sudden you're interested in election integrity, you know, it's like, come on. I mean, our community has been around for 20 years. Where have you been, conspiracy person? You know, why have you only just noticed that there might be something that you don't like about how things are going just now because your candidate lost? And if that's the thing that is driving you, then where are we going to be 12 months from now? So all of the, you know, all of the people that I see, I'm not like try to keep this apolitical because, you know, this is ultimately a democratic issue, not a political issue. But all of the lawmakers in the US that voted against certification of the election results, citing, you know, grave concerns with election integrity, I'm going to be interested to see where they are in a year from now. Are they going to be coming to our election integrity conferences? Are they going to have any interest in participating in making things better? Or does it all end with the partisan political effort, right? Is it all like now the you know, the votes have been cast, the votes have been certified, the inauguration's next week. Is it all going to die away? And if it does, then we know that it was just about partisan politics, not about democracy. But the rest of us in the community are still going to be here after the next election. In 4 years from now, our community will still be here, and we want it to, you know, like just to work, to function, to keep going and be fair. And it's not about a candidate. It's not about one person. It's not about, it's just about our society. Like just fundamentally, this is really an important issue. It cuts to the core. If you subvert the democratic process, you subvert the politics that sits on top of it. And then you subvert the society that sits on top of that. So.
And that's exactly it though. It's now become the issue of the day is election security and accuracy and trust in the voting process. I don't necessarily think it's just going to evaporate simply because there's a changeover. The level in which people distrust the system, when it's hit critical mass, has now become a major security concern for society at large. You're not seeing people, you know, you're not seeing people inherently focus on specific technologies or the entire electoral process, because that particular vendor who was under heavy scrutiny in the US, he wasn't the only one. And where's the scrutiny for the other ones? It's the distrust in the system itself, because people are now saying, we don't care about what software is running on these machines or how the votes are tabulated or how the thing is connected or whether it's Windows Vista XP or Linux or something like that. They're saying, we do not trust the people running the elections. Okay. I mentioned this to you earlier, but like that, there's an election observer who I spoke with who was handling the Georgia recount, or not the recount, but the runoff election. And there was an evacuation order for that building. There were people sitting outside of the recount office, jotting down license plates and license plates and cars and details about the people working in that office. And as they were getting close to the final count, they were under a police order to evacuate for security concerns due to a significant bomb threat. And this isn't the only place. Like the election observers themselves, the people handling, just simply counting ballots, are under attack. And now that criticism has kind of fermented and is boiling over, what happens next? Like where does the conspiracy go when it's being now essentially propagated throughout the entire community at large, a large number?
If the numbers don't lie. If the conspiracy was sort of like, if it originated with one person and it was being sort of spread in the context of one person and one race, and if that person then leaves public office and goes about their business, then maybe there is a chance that it will just sort of, you know, fade away. But if you are a person who's upset, like that poll that you mentioned, I think earlier when we were talking just before we started, there's a McLean's poll this week that I saw that said that, well, we try to keep it apolitical again. There was like, I think like 15% of Canadians, like all Canadian voters, obviously is a very heavy concentration of one particular party, but, but 15% of, maybe 20. So like 1 in 5 Canadian voters thinks that the U.S. election, shouldn't have been certified, that there were irregularities. And, that's like ask yourself, why do you think that? Like, what is at the core of this? And can you articulate your concerns without referring to Q or the president? Like what specifically is the concern? And there's that self-diagnostic in your brain that you have to run to say, oh my goodness, is my mind being co-opted by someone else for a political cause? And I mean, like if it was me and I realized that I was being used to advance a political message, I mean, I'd be very angry about that, to realize that. Like, and is there no self-reflection in this stuff? Because like, here's the thing, when you go after an election result, not the system beforehand, but when you go after an election result, you have got to have something, right? Because it is damaging to the trust in the society. And so if you're going after that result just because you don't like the result, then you are damaging society in bad faith. You are acting in bad faith, and you need to stop, right? If you have a body of evidence that points to some kind of malfeasance, that's a different question. And if you are pointing to structural weaknesses in how the votes are counted that doesn't allow you to have confidence, then you can raise that as well. But you have to wait until the election is over and has cooled off, and then work on fixing it for the next election. Because if you genuinely care about this from a democratic perspective, then you're interested in the next election, not the past election, the next election. That's where we got to focus.
It's legitimacy, though. Like your point about how this sort of is becoming prominent in circles outside of the U.S. right now. I'll use an analogy of the Signal. Signal right now is for anyone who's watching who isn't familiar with it, it's a secure messaging application. It's very popular for a number of communities, but it wasn't prominent. A select number of people used it. It wasn't very popular. WhatsApp is actually built on Signal. It's the same core technology, except Facebook has modified it for their own use. When WhatsApp changed their policy, people started looking at other options. And of course, no one was really looking at this exact same application that they could have migrated to until Elon Musk tweeted it out. All of a sudden, we're seeing millions of people focus on this thing that was always sitting there for years, 5, 6 years.
My whole family uses Signal. We've been using it for years, right? Because
I can see that, Alex, though, coming from you.
It's a good channel. You should have been using. People should have been using it from the beginning, and it's just like this whole thing with the election. It's sort of like, you've been doing something for a long time. You've been involved in a community for a long time, and then now all of a sudden a whole bunch of people discover something that you've been involved with, and it's great. I'm glad that we're talking about election integrity, but it's got to be for the right reasons, and it's got to be like. So anyway, so in terms of like, if you want to go back to the legitimacy of the U.S. election, what is the basis of the legitimacy of the U.S. election? Okay, it's very simple. They have paper ballots that they can go back and recount, and they did, and they did a risk limiting audit, and they did a recount in Georgia, and the results. So whatever you believe about the vendor, right? Whatever kind of scheme that you have in your mind, this vendor is connected to this vendor, which is connected to this government, which is connected, whatever comes up, it doesn't matter, because we got the paper ballots, and you can count up the paper ballots, and that's the physical reality.
Think about it a different way, though. So as a company, if another company wanted to do business with me or engage with my company, buy shares or do a deal or something like that, and something fell through, there is heavy regulation and visibility. In fact, they could sue me, request disclosure documents, and I'd have to produce whatever those documents are to go through with a fine-tooth comb and find any irregularities. If an investor were doing this, I would have to produce whatever financial documents or disclosure documents are required. In the context of voting, the voters are they're stakeholders. They're the ones engaging. The jurisdiction may be the contractual, stakeholder, but the voters are the ones who are actually utilizing this thing, and that's where the power is. So for understanding how to legitimize or understand or look into whether or not this election was held accurately, what do we do? Like, do the vendors all of a sudden have to produce all of this information? And as a vendor, I believe the onus is on both the election management body, whoever that may be, to run the election, but a vendor should be somewhat responsible for producing this evidence, because in light of that, I am in sort of an agreement, not necessarily believing in the conspiracy, but I am in agreement with the people that are challenging this and saying, we want to know what's going on. And I believe wholeheartedly that is something that the onus is on the company. We want to know what's going on. You have to prove that you ran the election accurately. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay. So, there's one particular vendor in the US that's been receiving a lot of criticism lately. A lot of that criticism is just simply I don't even know where they've come up with this stuff. I mean, it's just as far as I can tell, it's just bad faith. It's just created to, it's just working backwards to what you want the result to be. So it didn't work out the way I wanted. So why is that? My cognitive dissonance tells me that something went wrong. I'm going to just say that it was stolen. How could I rationalize in my mind that it was stolen? Well, maybe the company was bad. Well, maybe the company, the particular company that I'm thinking of, this is a company that I'm on record criticizing things that this company has done, right? But I didn't criticize their conduct and their honorability, right? I mean, I'm not claiming that company did something wrong to rig the election, right? Because I have no evidence that they rigged. I mean, if I had evidence that they rigged the election, I mean, anybody, if anybody had evidence, they would want to bring that forward, right? But I don't have evidence. But the concerns are the procedural concerns, and the way that we deal with this whole modern times, we have private companies actually running elections, right? We didn't used to have that, but now we do. So sort of since roughly since the 90s in the US, and to a lesser extent, since the 2000s in Canada, we have private companies running elections. Okay, fine. But there has to be some way that as you point out, that they can be sort of held to account. The way they deal with it in the US is, at least the best practice is, the machine that the company builds is just there for convenience, right? Just there to make things quick and easy. And you're trying to make a situation where you don't have to trust that machine, right? We want to make it quick. We want to make it easy. We want to make it usable, convenient, accessible, right? That's really important. That's one of the main motivations in the US for having all of this automation in the election process is for accessibility, that people with accessibility needs are not relegated to use the mothballed machine at the back of the precinct, that everyone's using the same machine. In Los Angeles County, they have the voting systems for all people, VSAP, right? That's the idea. That's the value proposition of having all of this automation. But we don't have to trust the automation because it's producing a record, an evidentiary trail. Now, in this case, in the US, the best practice is for paper. So prints out the result on a piece of paper of what you chose. So you're clickety clacking on your screen, or if maybe you're using an accessible device, and it's going to produce a paper record, like a printout, and then you say, yes, this is what I chose. Now, obviously in the US, there's issues because their ballots are monstrosities, 50 candidates, you have to sort of say, wow, they're going to go through and check everything. And there's some evidence to suggest that they might not notice if the machine flips votes, but that's kind of, I don't know, like if we're doing a Canadian election, at least, there's one contest, and so you can at least look at that and say, yeah, that's, I clicked on the machine and printed out a paper ballot, and now I can walk that over to the scanner and just have it scanned, and then that's it. So there's a record, a physical record. See, the reason we're in all of this trouble is because guess what? The physical world and the digital world aren't the same world. And you can do things in the digital world that you cannot do in the physical world. I can't take my LP, my daughter's learning how to play Sunshine of Your Love, like Cream. So I got out like the LP, right? I got it, my mom still got it. And so I can give that to her, she can put it on, right? But I can't just go like this and then have two Cream records. Right? But you can do that in the digital world. That's why piracy is a thing, right? And that is why, leaving this all in the digital world without anything to compensate for that factor is where we run into trouble. So if we're going to put things online in a digital context, right? We need some kind of digital evidentiary trail to complement the physical paper trail that is the current best practice in the US, right? So I mean, you've got to have something, right? You can't just have a database with a website front end, right? If you just have that, it's votes go in. I mean, this is what we've seen in Ontario, like up to this point. Votes go into a private company server, and then totals come out. And I mean, a lot of people apparently are okay with that. I'm not okay with that. I don't know why everyone else is okay with that. So
it's interesting seeing like schematics of how these systems tend to operate and where they say the checks and balances are going to be in making sure that everything's running accurately. But then it's just other computers. It's just what's that thing? It's turtles all the way down. It's just computers checking computers, and who are they convincing? Where is the evidence?
Like this is what always happens. Every press interview I do on this topic, it goes like this. They say, "Hey, well, what are you looking at now? What's on your mind today?" And I say, "Oh, well, we're doing research on this particular aspect of election technology, and we have the following concerns, and we are like asking to have a national conversation that involves like establishing best practices." I'm getting my stay-at-home order emergency alert right now.
Yeah, me too. I just saw it come in.
So
times, Alex. Yeah.
So we want to do elections the way that they're being done properly elsewhere. That's all we're asking for. And then they'll go to the election official. And again, this is external to the 2020 presidential race. This is up here in Canada and different contexts. Okay, they'll go to the election official and they'll say, well, what about all of these concerns that Dr. Essex raised? And he did research on it. Like, what's your response? And they say, well, and they always, like every article, well, we're confident. It's always how it goes. Well, we're confident. Now, take that sentence. We are confident. Okay, so the subject is we, meaning the election official and the city. All right, not you, the candidate, not you, the voter. Right, we, the candidate. And I think that's great that they're confident, but it's not their election. It's our election. Right, they're just the custodians and administrators of the election. They're discharging their statutory duty to us. So make us confident, right? Give us something to be confident in. And just saying we're confident, that's not evidence of anything. We ran a penetration test. And so we're confident we ran a penetration test. I'm like, okay, may I see the penetration test report? Well, no, you can't see that. It's not public. Okay, well, but we are 100% confident in this penetration test. I'm like, do you know how to read a penetration test report? Like, do you understand the words that are being said? Well, we have people and they're confident. I'm like, okay, but do you, not you, Matthew, but I mean, do you sort of like Ontario, like, are you okay with that? That it's just sort of like, they're saying it's fine, move along. These aren't the droids you're looking for. I mean, like, and these are, I just want to say this. The election officials in Canada are like best in world. And I have no beef with any of them. Canada's lucky to have them. But as we move forward into this sort of digital version of democracy, like we've got to keep up, and we got to do something, because like we can't just float along, just doing like having these. Well, I can bank online. Your bank, like you know what your balance is. You can see your balance. It's not the same thing, right? And so we got to start asking these questions. Well, what are we going to do when we do have that candidate finally who challenges the election and actually follows through with a legal challenge and says, I don't think this election was right. I think it was wrong. I think it was spoiled. I want the city to produce evidence that it was counted correctly. And then all of a sudden the city, the city might, whichever city it is, I don't know which city is going to be the one to have this challenge. I'm pretty confident it will happen eventually, maybe in 2022, maybe 2026. I don't know when it's going to happen, but one day, Elsa, you will. Yeah. And so when that does happen, right? What's going to happen? The judge, if the judge is willing to hear from technical experts, which that's also debatable, because there have been cases where they just, like, I've been involved in a lawsuit where the judge just didn't, like, as like a technical, like, expert, like as an expert witness, and it just, like, it wasn't part of the decision at all. It wasn't even referenced in the decision, right? But one day they're going to get a bunch of technical experts to come in and say, yeah, there is this person, like, we can't disprove what this person is saying. And there's like a lack of evidence. So what are we going to do about it, right? And I would like for us to not wait for that lawsuit to settle things. Like, let's do it now.
The good thing, I will say this very carefully, but the good thing that did come out of what's happening in the U.S. right now is this stuff is being brought to light. When I first started in this, people always talked about trust. And I used to say that. I'm like, look, we're not building a voting system. We're building trust in a voting system. That's what we have to do. And I built a lot of the stuff that we've come that became the company based on the criticisms, based on these research. And I looked at it from a different approach. Instead of building a service that we were going to sell, I looked at it and said, it's a challenge. There are barriers that we need to overcome, and that's the reason why this stuff isn't. You can't just vote on your phone federally right now. Like, it should be ubiquitous, but it's not. And we understood that trust is always going to be the big factor. Now that this stuff has emerged in the U.S., it's become top of mind. It's no longer like a case of, oh, hey, what happens when? Like what you just referenced. You were saying the same thing a few years ago. That's no longer the case. You can just point to, go on any news site right now, and you will see the evidence of what happens when an election is being contested. In the Canadian context, without any evidence, I would be, again, I like friendly wagers. I would wager heavily that there's going to be a candidate in an upcoming election that simply says, I don't believe in the results. And I'm talking about in Canada, not in the US. They will have to prove that there's going to be audits, there are going to be lawsuits, simply because the Pandora's box is open. The idea of challenging an election result is no longer some far-fetched pipe dream that nobody would do it because everyone's in good faith. Good faith isn't necessarily the barometer of politics at this point.
Yeah, so I hope you're right about the idea that the game has changed, in the sense that I hope that that election officials in Canada are going to start finally looking at this threat in the vast matrix of threats and start, like, preparing for it, because again, you and I have like, so, I mean, you come to these academic conferences, right? So you know what's on our minds in the research community. These are international conferences. Like everyone across the democratic world is struggling with these threats, and one of our challenges is just to get legislators interested in this. But even after the election was contested in the U.S., I was doing panels where everyone wanted to talk about COVID, poll stations in COVID times. And I'm like, well, okay, we'll have another pandemic again, I'm sure, at some point, maybe even in our lives, and we need to prepare for that. But if you had to rank threats right now, I don't know, I'm not sure where this places relative to the bad faith election challenge threat, but the like domestic internal threats, right, from the candidate, right? But what if it's not even a bad faith challenge? What if it is a good faith challenge? And it is now suddenly harder to, I mean, like what happened in the US was easy, like at least from our community, to say this is like there's nothing here that we are seeing to cast doubt in our minds, right? And we actually have lots of counter evidence to support that it was done right. But what if it was a more ambiguous situation where you had, some of these counselors that I talk to, I mean, they're just like, they're just decent folks. They're just small town, they're telling me they're walking down the street, they're at Tim Hortons and people coming up and then it's, that's a damn thing that happened to you, so-and-so. I'm not gonna name names. I remember talking to somebody that said that, people came up to me in Walmart and they were like, oh, it's just a terrible thing about that election. And, again, they know that if they push this issue too heavily, that they're going to damage the trust in the community. And for them, they put their community first. They said, look, I remember talking to some people, and I talked to somebody once for hours, and they just had a stack of circumstantial evidence, and they're like just document after document, and none of it added up to a smoking gun. At the same time, it did add up to, I think, enough questions that, like, we're not going to reverse their decision, right? We're not going to reverse their election. It's over. It's done. And they've accepted that, but they're sitting there saying, like, I'm not trying to challenge my own election, but I'm trying to, like, I'm actually worried what's going to happen to the next person. And I mean, that kind of, it's actually kind of heartwarming in a sense that, like, that they can see outside of themselves and they can sort of see like the society that they want to live in, where we do trust our elections, and they want to work towards that, right? It's no longer about them. It's about something bigger than them. And I guess maybe that's where we really need to kind of get our minds focused on is like, if you are somebody who believes that something went wrong, okay, fine, join us in making it better for the next person, because this, it's not, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen.
The thing, you have to hit rock bottom before you can move up. That's typically, it's always the case. It's always reactive. People are inherently, people say things about the climate crisis that, scientists and academics are talking about how, horrible it's going to be, like Mad Max, we're all going to be starving, the oceans are going to rise. But no one's really going to care about it until, I think, it's staring them in the face. I think that's human nature. And I think, some people are more proactive than reactive, but at the end of the day, going back to that signal anecdote that I talked about earlier, it takes something to really spark the interest in the public. And like I said, to take one good thing away from what's happened down in the US is people now kind of understand or are caring about all of the stuff that you and I have been talking about for a number of years, and your colleagues internationally, which is, if we are going to be implementing electronic systems into a inherently secure paper-based system, that synthesis needs to come with a certain regulations, certain standards, best practices, etc., to really build in trust into those systems. You can't do anything independent without, I guess another way to look at it is, you can't take a traditional system and replace it without thinking about what the aspects of that traditional system made it preferred. I remember Peter Urban, or Sir Peter Urban from IFES, giving a talk in September 2017, I believe, in Bucharest. And he said, well before anybody was talking about major online voting or anything like that, he said, look, I'm running elections in really places with high, big inequality, high illiteracy, challenging environments where people just simply don't trust the election due to corruption, due to all of these things. If we are going to move forward, you have to do it you have to take both of those things into consideration. You have to take somebody who has, the iPhone 12 and is very techno literate, and also somebody who doesn't speak, doesn't speak the language, can't read or write. Their vote is just as equal to everyone else's. And if they're going to be engaging in this process, how do we make that synthesis equitable to everybody who's doing it? And now that, the convenience that you talked about in the US for the voting systems and why they were very much preferred, due to, no longer hanging chads, you don't have any irregular markings or something. It was sort of standardized the voting process. I think moving forward, people are going to start caring about security. They're going to start caring about what the industry calls verifiability. The idea that we need to be able to evidentially prove that the election results are accurate. I remember a colleague of yours, Dr. Benelo from Microsoft, talking about the system that he created, the end-to-end verifiability. And he was saying, he's like, this is a zero trust system. He's like, you shouldn't trust anybody. In fact, you should challenge everything. Everything should be challenged. Famously, his contribution to computer science and cryptography was the Benelo challenge, which is you should always be challenging the machines. Don't trust the machines. Don't trust me. Don't trust the vendor. Don't trust the city. Challenge everything, and it's just the way things have to be moving forward.
So the thing about the thing about somebody like Josh is that he's, as far as I can tell, and I've known him for a long time, he's like a good guy. He's like a good guy. He's a good faith actor. And when he says challenge the system, he means let me provide evidence to you. And the evidence is, let me show you my work. Let me show you that I summed 1 + 1 and I got 2. And so that's what he's saying. And the problem comes when you have people that, I guess, look at 1 + 1 = 2 and say, well, no, it's not 2. It's 3. It's 3. It's always been 3. And it's really bad that you're summing it up to 2. We have the saying in the community. We used to have a saying in the community. I think it got obliterated this past winter. The saying was, elections aren't about, just convincing the winner that they won. It's about convincing the loser that they lost. Right? Now, that was always sort of kind of the idea is that a fair election is about allowing the society to sort of come to an agreement about what happened. And the people that are the ones that the winner has no problem with the election results, right? I've seen this happen lots of times where, before the US election, I've seen this in Canada where it's you start here, oh, well, we might have to challenge the election, or we might have, the Ontario's introducing optical scanners. We might have to take a look at that or whatever. And then the individual wins, and all of a sudden it all melts away, right? So it's not about convincing the winner. The winner's convinced, right? It's about convincing the loser. But the question is, what happens if? So in mathematics, we always like to talk about zero knowledge proofs. In cryptography, zero knowledge proofs, and one of them is one of the properties of a zero knowledge proof is soundness, and that is that an honest person can't be tricked. am I getting my properties wrong? But the idea is that it relies on like if you give the honest good faith evidence that should convince a reasonable person, but then the person is not being reasonable, not being honest, not acting in good faith, then what happens then? So I don't know how to solve that, but fortunately we do have, I think, some indication of how we can solve at least providing sound evidence in a digital space.
That's what I would say is probably the most critical thing moving forward. And if we could sum up like this whole takeaway from the U.S. context, imagine if it was contested and just handing them the evidence, handing them the paper, handing them the cryptographic proof, and saying, okay, here it is. You find the evidence of irregularities. You give it back to us, and we'll go from there. I was speaking to a number of clerks in Ontario about that, and that was my advice to them. I'm like, look, if you're seeing this firsthand right now, everyone cares about it right now. It's a huge issue. And I said, imagine being challenged and just being able to say, you're right. You should challenge this thing, handing it all over to them, and then saying, okay, come back to me. You come back to me. If you find anything, I hope you find that everything was operating properly. But if there's anything, just let me know. Having the ability to just wash your hands of it, not court cases, not anything where you have to kind of fight against the system. Just simply saying, yeah, you're right. You know what? Here's a million ballots. Go count them and let me know what the number is. We've already counted them 3 times. You tell me if we're off by any.
And just to clarify, when you say wash your hands, you mean wash your hands of the suspicion, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
It's all out in the open. You're providing them something that is complete, that would give them enough evidence that if something did go wrong, that it would be there in the evidence.
Think about the flat earther conspiracy people. People are like, you know what, you're right. You should challenge that perspective. Here's how you challenge if the earth is round, and then they go out and do it. And famously on Netflix, there's some shows about it where they'll actually take a horizon measurement or something, and they'll find that their presuppositions were inaccurate, and maybe they change their mind, maybe they don't, but at least when challenged and the evidence is in front of them and they're actually going through the evidence themselves, they can come back and say, maybe they double down and say, you know what, the machine is, or the telescope or whatever is inaccurate or something, but at least the evidence is there and they don't have anything to come back towards.
I think that's, this, I think this is where we're at. It's like the academic community and the industry have the ability to, I think have the ability to work together to provide evidence. Like if we want to move to digital elections, if we want to move to online elections, I think that there is a path forward to do that. And I think that there are at least certain members of the industry that are actually genuinely interested in doing that. And that's all we can do, right? And you go back to so Obama had this example about he was talking about the football game, and everyone can see what happened in the football game, but then the losing team says, well, I still didn't lose, or it's you have so for example, chess. Imagine that you have chess is not, there's no hidden information, it's all on the table. Right. Mm-hmm. So we can, our community can work towards giving you the sort of the digital cryptographic equivalent of a chessboard where you can get all the information you need and it's all there. But then, it really comes down to other people to at least not, do that kind of. So I bought a car this summer. I had a used car, and we it was dripping oil, and we said, you got to fix that. And then, oh yeah, we'll fix that. So we went to pick up the car, and it was still dripping oil. And we said, well, what are you doing? You said you were going to fix. Oh no, it's not dripping oil. We're like, yeah, it's dripping oil. Look at that right there. There's a drip. And they're like, no, it's not dripping oil. And then we climb underneath and we scoop the oil on our fingers, and we're like, look, it's dripping oil. And they're like, that's not oil. It's like that kind of, I mean, I don't know
Mm.
how we solve that kind of bad faith. You know, would you even call that gaslighting? I mean, you know, just sort of tugging at the fabric of reality. I don't know how we solve that, but at least we can provide enough evidence that if you're going to at least,
I don't know. I think with elections, you got to shine some light on everything. I think, like, look, paper ballots and in-person voting is, you know, everyone says it's the gold standard. It's the preferred method, but there are places where you would not trust that system. You know, like I'm not afraid to name out these countries, but would you trust a paper ballot cast in Russia as being accurately tabulated? In Brazil, I was just in Brazil a few months ago, and they don't use paper because they have issues with corruption, and they've decided that electronic is actually more secure and more trustworthy for them, that particular country, than paper, because there is a chance that once you send that ballot into the ballot box, something happens. I remember a video in the last Russian election where the poll worker, when they were counting the ballots, walked in front of the camera with a bunch of balloons, and then something happened, and you know, that was it. Like that's like the level of integrity.
Like
literally
Batman or something, you know. Yeah, like
so, you know, with elections, it's got to be trust right now, and I don't think there's any clear answer for anything. We could all revert back to paper. You know, the Netherlands reverted back to paper. And
to be fair, elections are never. I mean, so my colleagues like to say that, you know, there are no silver bullets in elections, right? They're not ever going to be crystal clear cut. Like there's always going to be some kind of, you know, it's just because there's so high stakes. There's so many players involved. They're just really their own problem space. That's why people really need to kind of get off this like train about it's just like shopping online or banking online. It's like, I mean, everything about it is different, except that you're looking to use the internet to do it. And so, you know, they're just really not the same at all. So, you know, I just think we're at a point where, okay, maybe I as a computer science professor and you as a vendor can't solve like bad faith conspiracies, but we can definitely do something about maybe, I don't know what you want to call it, like good faith conspiracies, or just, you know, like well-intentioned and well-deserved skepticism and scrutiny. There's nothing wrong with wanting to know how the election was counted up, to have evidence that the election was counted up. There's nothing wrong with that. You should want that. And it is about legitimacy. You know, I remember one time when I was an assistant, you know, young assistant professor, I did like a science fair with some, you know, with like some grade 6s, and they had me I brought in my US voting machine, and I put Super Mario on it because there's nothing stopping me from just running Super Mario in an emulator. And I was talking to the kids, and I said, hey, you know, this is a US voting machine, and I didn't modify it. Like I didn't like take anything out to do. I just flipped open DOS and I plugged in a USB key and loaded it up this, you know, to say that I hacked it is you know, is I didn't. I mean, I just put on Mario. I said to the kids, like, what might be an example of something that could happen that would be bad if somebody got elected that wasn't really who people voted for. And I remember this I'll never forget this. One kid said, well, you could collapse the economy. And it's just like, so I always point to that. It's like, you know, like kids get it. Like the right person has to be the person that people voted for has to be the one. I mean, there's if there's all these, you know, I mean, there's always going to be conspiracies, bad faith conspiracies about legitimacy. I mean, witness the birther movement, you know, wow, you know, it's like, it's just like, they're going to do the damage no matter what. But what can we do, right? Working together, you know, the industry, the academic community, you know, hopefully also the government sort of side of this, the public side of this, working together. I mean, the U.S., the public side, the federal government and the state level and the academics, they all work together. I would love to see this happen in Canada. I've been doing my best to sort of, try to do that. But it's a little bit adversarial right now with some of this sort of like unverifiable online voting that's sort of being kind of offered and just sort of casually used in Ontario. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess I want the clerks to know that if it seems like I'm sort of kind of pooping the party, it's only ever out of like my love and respect for the democratic process in this province, and I want them to not encounter the kind of problems that we're seeing in the U.S. I want there to be and to be clear, the U.S. had evidence to support the outcome, right? They had paper ballots. They went back and counted them, and they still had this problem. So what happens if you don't have evidence? If you just have a vendor that's collecting ballots and then just reporting a result? Like,
I hate to hypothesize, but what do you think would have happened if they were still running the old DRE machines down in Georgia or Pennsylvania or something? Just the old school ones where it was just a punch card you put in and took out of it for the tabulation or something.
Well, anybody that wants to in the comments, and don't forget to click like and subscribe, but anybody in the comments can correct me here, but I believe that Louisiana still was using unverifiable DREs, right? So, but you'll notice that state went a certain way and it sort of escapes all of the scrutiny if you're approaching this from a partisan political viewpoint. If you're approaching this from a democratically minded, I don't care who wins the election as long as they're the legitimate winner. If you're coming at it from that standpoint, then the U.S. is, so like Chris Krebs said, it's the most secure election in history because they've managed to convince a lot of the holdout states to change their ways and to sort of sign on to something, because the U.S. has a federal agency that is just the knowledge gatherer, the sort of the focal point of knowledge and expertise, but they can't make the states do it because the states run the elections. So the states can choose to adopt the federal standard. They can choose to adopt the standard and then modify stuff or whatever, or they can just choose to ignore it. And for many years, a lot of states just ignored it. They just did their own thing. And there, it's there's a lot of questions why that was. Part of it is just, I think, awareness. Part of it is just, maybe some cost issue. But
I don't know. I was at a Secretary of State conference, and Hicks was the guest speaker from the EAC. One of the chairs of the EAC was coming in, and the EAC disperses HAVA funding to the states to upgrade their election systems, famously.
Yes,
But the Secretary of State Association also, one of the gentlemen stood up and said, we historically have this, I can't remember what it would be, a formal objection to even listening to the EAC from when the EAC first emerged. It's on the books, still existing as we have passed a motion to object to listening to you or adhering to your standards. And the gentleman stood up at this conference a few years ago and said, we should probably think about removing that, because in hindsight, we think you're doing a really good job, and we think you've done a really good job securing our elections and helping us. So, we're not going to tackle that right now, but just for future reference, we should probably get that stricken from the record. And it just kind of shows you that the autonomy, the famous U.S. autonomy of the states' rights and independence of the states, is very much alive and in how they roll everything out. I don't think in the U.S. context there will ever be a unified agreement about how each state should run their election. But the EAC, I think, has done a fantastic job of, like you said, centralizing the knowledge, centralizing the thought leadership in this particular space. And I'm in agreement. I would love to see something like this up in Canada.
I mean, look, I've been around the U.S. context for a while, and I'm aware that some people have some criticisms of the EAC, and they also have a lot of limitations. They've got a pretty modest budget. And I think that pound for pound, they do really great work. I think that I can't imagine what the U.S. would look like without an EAC. I wish Canada had an EAC-like agency federally. Now, Elections Canada does a great job. I love Elections Canada. I think they do good work. But there's no place in this country right now to centralize the thought leadership. So provinces kind of do their own thing, and municipalities in turn do their own thing. And okay, so, you know, sure, regional autonomy, but at least in the US, if a state is going to ignore the VVSG and just do their own thing, at least you can sort of like say that. You can say, okay, there's an acknowledgement that they are rejecting what is been established by a kind of like, you know, in some cases, international consortium of people. They're rejecting this international, you know, consortium, like the standard, you know, so there's actually something that they have to go against, right? Whereas in, you know, an Ontario municipality, there is no standard, and they're free to essentially do whatever they want. And there's no kind of baseline of like, well, nothing to point to say, well, but, you know, this is what the, you know, Canadian, you know, Election Assistance Commission, well, that's, I think that has the same acronym as a political party in Quebec. So that we'd have to, you know, change that or whatever, but there would be at least some sort of understanding of like, this is what the baseline is. This is what all of the experts kind of have agreed upon, and you're not doing it. And, you know, maybe you have a reason, but now you have to sort of, I think, be on the hot seat to explain what that reason is. And if it turns out that it's just, well, I don't want to do it because it's hard for me, then there might be a opportunity to sort of like kind of, you know, kind of allow the local population to kind of, you know, criticize and sort of like kind of, you know, help them move towards something. I think that's really what the EAC has done, is helped, you know, just like set a point on the horizon for everyone to move towards, and then give them money to go in that direction. And you know what happened? Where did HAVA and the EAC come from? It came from Florida 2000. It was like a big meltdown. So, you know, maybe now, at least in the US, there'll be some sort of more interest. I hope there's bipartisan support for this, because I'm going to tell you, the last 4 years was really one-sided in terms of like which party was wanting to do election reform. It tends to be,
you know, I would agree somewhat with that, but if you, from what I've seen, actually, especially in the US, and famously, there's this idea that, you know, a certain party doesn't really like online voting, but in the US, it's completely the inverse. In fact, that party is the one promoting it heavily. They're using it in their caucus elections. They're using it in their what's it called, candidate elections. They're using it to increase Yokava for military and overseas voters. Like there is a, I think, despite this particular field, and I think to our credit, we are in a very timely industry right now. That sort of, you know, has emerged. It's something like I mentioned to Josh. He's working on something for 30 years and no progress. It's sort of like this academic theory, and then all of a sudden it's just,
well, lots of progress in the academic community, and I can certainly attest for that. I've been involved in a lot of that progress myself. But you're right, it hasn't kind of maybe spilled over into the real world until kind of more lately. Although, I mean, to be fair, we were running, you know, cryptographically and verifiable elections, I think, like, you know, in the 2000s. And, you know, maybe in some sense it was an idea before its time. I mean, I remember when I was in grad school, I always used to say that, like, by the time like people like Captain Kirk and Jean-Luc Picard are walking around, we'll have end-to-end verifiable elections. Maybe not in our lifetimes. And everyone always was like, "Oh, you're being cynical." And I mean, I hope they're right. I hope I'm wrong, and that at least now.
Well, look at. Oh no, sorry. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, I just hope that, you know, maybe now, you know, now is an opportunity for us to you know, have these kind of conversations. Because the thing is that, like, you know, like Ontario, like, just kind of from my perspective, is like it's like a runaway freight train on some kind of collision course here. They really want to do online voting. Like, not all the cities, but I'm anticipating in 2022 that the number of cities that will use online voting will be significantly higher than even in 2018, which was already significantly high. Like, what we have seen is a clear exponential growth curve. It's a clear doubling, double. Every time, every 4 years, the number of cities that have used online voting has doubled. And if it doubles again, you're basically gonna be like getting close to the entire. I don't know if it'll double again, but we're gonna see. But they want to use this technology, and there's a lot of perfectly good reasons why they want to use internet voting. I want to use internet voting. I do everything else on the internet. I'd like to use it, right? But we got to confront the evidence question, right? We got to confront the ballot secrecy question. And I've been confronting it in my research. I think you have been confronting it in some of your initiatives, some of your partnerships. But the election officials, at least in Ontario, and I certainly hope that the minister, the provincial minister, will start to consider this. They've got to confront. We've got to start doing something about this, and let what happened in the United States be the reckoning. Let us not wait until we have until somebody's storming Queen's Park, which heaven forbid that ever happens. And I mean, there's reason to believe that that's not going to happen in Canada because we're sort of generally less excitable than our friends south of the border. And there's a lot of
maybe except I would say Montreal is a little bit. Montreal tends to be a little bit excitable. As someone who lived there for a number of years.
I don't think let's be clear. It's unlikely that we'll see an insurrection in the scale that we saw in the United States. It's unlikely that we'll see that here in Canada, but it is likely that we will see something that is going to push back against the election sort of legitimacy claims. And that pushback might be a good faith pushback. It might be a bad faith pushback, but even the chief electoral officer of Ontario, has said this. I really like this line. He said that as people become more aware of how the technology works, they're naturally going to have questions, and there needs to be something to give them reassurance that their ballot was secret, that their vote counted, right? And that's, I mean, like that's a no-brainer. I mean, why are we even talking about this, right? But I mean, at least he's on record now as saying this, and at least now somebody in government is able to provide. Well, I mean, there are other places in government that are providing that kind of thought leadership, but I would, at least in the digital space, I would like to see more of that thought leadership from our government partners. And I don't know what it's going to take. I always used to think it was going to take there being some kind of hacking incident. Up until like this election, we were focused on foreign threats. I mean, I wrote a paper about the 2018 Ontario municipal election where I clearly articulated that I was worried about foreign threats, but also domestic threats, people challenging. But like myself, not included, it's not been on the radar. Let this now be the call to get this on ministerial agendas for once. Finally, let us tackle this issue.
Yeah, I was going to say earlier, Kodak developed a digital camera back in, I think, the 70s, and they didn't think it was timely enough. So they sat on it. And then, of course, they were completely eradicated in the market due to, being overtaken by other options. It's the same thing here. You're sitting here talking about hacking incidents. You're talking about contesting elections, just from a theoretical point of view. But now all of a sudden it's here, it's in front of us. I didn't end up looking like what you assumed it would look. Just probably Kodak's original digital camera probably didn't look like what was in the market at the time. But it's here now. This is what it looks like. We don't need to worry about the shape or form of the threat. The threat is here, and from a company who'd be responsible for securing an election, hacking is just one element. But now it's, I think, the evidentiary proof of work, I think, is going to be absolutely mission critical in providing safe and secure voting, whether it be offline, online, or otherwise, moving forward. 100%.
like look at how Elon Musk designs rockets, right? I mean, I grew up like being a total like aerospace nerd as a kid. I've taken my family to the U.S. Museum of the Air Force like 2 summers in a row. Celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landings and stuff. And so, I'm very much, like this. I find the because it's like kind of like at the knife's edge of design. When you look at like how SpaceX is designing the rockets and how Elon Musk kind of applies, like he does things that like I've never thought of, and I dare say probably some NASA astronauts have just never thought of, and now that he's doing them, it's like, oh, you can land the boosters on a launch pad. Like, wow, that's crazy. Oh, your rocket is made out of like stainless steel panels. It looks like something out of like a 1930s sci-fi like movie. It's just like it's got like little wings. Like that looks ridiculous, but it's completely changing the game. And you sort of ask yourself like, okay, they're doing amazing things. I want to do amazing things. How does one do amazing things, right? How are they doing these amazing things? Well, they're using this, what like they call like, first principles design. They just go back to the first principles and start asking tough questions. Do we really need this? In the past, we haven't had this, but we do need this. So this has to stay. Just, it's kind of a deconstruction, and maybe we can't do a complete deconstruction. Like, elections are kind of more constrained in some sense than aerospace, like than rocket design, which is already really constrained. But I would like to put that out there, for any election officials that may ever watch this, municipal clerks or people, staff that work in the clerk's office is like, I mean, can we ever return to the first principles? And by first principles, I don't mean the physics like in rocket design. I mean the legal principles of democratic elections, right? Because they're all there. They're all in black and white. You can go look them up. And if you can't find them, send me an email. I'll send them to you. We sit back and we look at those first principles and we say, okay, we got to have ballot secrecy. What do we mean by ballot secrecy? Do we mean that everyone votes and the vendor can see how you voted, and then they just like collect all of your votes together and they say, oh yeah, Matthew voted for this candidate and Alex voted for this candidate, but I promise I won't use that information for anything. Is that what we mean by ballot secrecy? Well, maybe, I don't know. I don't think that's a very good definition, but that's the definition it seems that we're implicitly using in Ontario right now. So if we're going to do that, at least let's acknowledge that that's what we're doing. And I don't think that we're acknowledging that. I think we need to acknowledge that, the vendors that operated in 2018, there's lots of evidence to suggest that they can link your identity to your vote. And I said this back in 2018. Can you imagine the US president having a list of names and addresses and who voted for whom? And then imagine that list accidentally got leaked out onto the internet by some like rogue conspirator. And then there was a tweet saying, oh, gee, it would be a real shame if something happened to these people. And I remember kind of like saying that and sort of feeling like 2 years ago that maybe I was being ridiculous. And maybe I am being ridiculous still, but I feel like maybe.
Do you still feel that now?
Maybe I'm less ridiculous now, but the point is I'm obviously speaking in a hypothetical sort of sense here, which is that we have this thing called the secret ballot. We need this thing called the secret ballot. The impeachment trial yesterday. A lot of press articles reported that sources inside of the Republican Party were saying that they felt danger for their family's safety. Based off of like if they were to vote against or vote in favor of impeachment. So like we need a secret ballot in the regular election, in general elections. It's just like we need, but like we should, like we're not even debating it. It's a legal principle. It's an international agreement. So that's our first principle. So let's start with that and start asking questions like, does the vendor guarantee ballot secrecy? What do they do to get, like, what is the thing that they use to guarantee? Are they encrypting the votes end to end? Are they like are they, like, is it leaving my machine in an encrypted state that the vendor cannot like see my name beside my vote, you know?
Mm.
Like
Well, I think famously there was a company that was using a mixnet to kind of shuffle them as they were going through the process. But upon further review of that system, like in theory, it looks fine. And it's like, to kind of to your point about ballot secrecy, in theory, it worked. Like it was interesting. In principle, in actuality, the system facilitated essentially a completely fraudulent election with cryptographic proof. So you would have been able to hack the election, manipulate it to whatever it was going to say, and still produce no result or no evidence that was contrary to the result, but in fact was completely manipulated from the inside.
Now, can I ask you, are you referring to a system that was used by a small country in Europe that has a lot of interesting geography and because so you are correct that the vulnerability in that case, that cryptographic vulnerability could be used to generate what's called an accepting proof. So if you ran it through the software would say that it was okay, even though it wasn't okay. But at least in that instance, the flaw was detectable. So even though the software would have accepted it, even though that, like, if it had been exploited, there would still be evidence. And the issue is just that in the beginning, people weren't looking, they wouldn't be looking for that evidence, but it would exist. Some of it might not exist, especially if they cherry picked certain prime numbers that had certain, they were using number field sieves to, pick primes with certain properties. They might be able to do certain things. So that there might be some concern there. But, in general, when you do have these evidence chains, even if I've written a paper where, we got the cryptographic end-to-end system to prove false results, but all of the cryptographic trickery that we used tricked the software, but it was still visible in the evidence chain. I mean, so even if people weren't initially looking for it, it was there, it was in the open, it was just hiding in plain sight for a while. So I think that's really kind of, I think an important point is that, especially with some of these cryptographic methods for proving digital elections, that that the proof is there, and if it's in the public, eventually it's about as good as we can get in terms of finding evidence of wrongdoing or finding faults. It's because it's just all there. It's not being locked away, right? What we saw in Ontario in 2018 was a lot of evidence being locked away, right? So we just don't know what happened. We just have to trust it. Now, I'm not disputing the election results at all, but I would like to see a change. I'd like to see going forward that things are different, because the way it was being done, you just have this website with a database, and people just log in with their basically their either direct identifier or re-identifiable identifier, and then they vote in that same web session. So the voting site, if they don't see your name directly, they certainly see your birth date, the town you live in, which we established is probably uniquely identifies at least half of the Ontario population, and then how you voted, all in the same web session, right? And so there's that whole link, and so
moving forward, what would be the ideal outcome for the change? What's the ideal moving forward from the academic perspective?
So I think that I think that a lot of the election integrity people would just be happy to leave things as a paper ballot form. So we have paper ballot elections, and we do risk limiting audits. Risk limiting audits have a lot of shortcomings, especially in how they are applied in the US and sort of in practice. They don't audit everything. They'll pick one race, and then a partisan elected official will pick the race to audit. So there's a lot of issues there. In some sense, what actually might be, I think, better. Unless you're going to do a paper ballot election where you count it up on the spot, which is what federally we do in Canada. And the Americans have really kind of struggled with this idea that we really do this. We really do this. Okay, we count it all up that night in front of all the scrutineers, right? So I pour my box onto the table, and I'm putting the ballots into piles, and everyone's watching me. And if someone's got a problem, speak now or forever hold your peace, because you can see what I'm doing. And, it's just right there in front of you with your own eyes. So obviously I can't think of something that's much, much better than that. But if we are going to do an online, if we're going to move in that direction, we've got to have some way to provide evidence to people. And so that methodology we've talked about it a bunch of times already in this chat: cryptographic end-to-end verifiability. And the idea is we can't say how everyone voted, because guess what? That's a democratic principle, ballot secrecy. So we need to somehow do two things at the same time. We need to prove to you your vote counted and everything's counted up right. But we also have to protect your vote from prying eyes, from other people seeing it. We have to do both at the same time, and that's why voting online is a hard thing to do. So the only way that we know how to do both of those things at the same time is using cryptography. It's like really one of the only ways that we know how to do that, and it's a pretty good way. It definitely works. It definitely provides, I think. The paradigm works. The paradigm can provide that evidence, and it can provide something that paper ballots can't provide, which is universal verifiability. So I don't have to be in the room, right? Like right now with Elections Canada, I have to, if I'm a candidate, I got to go get an army of I remember when I was counting up the election in 2019, October, there's a bunch of the candidate representatives, some of them I think must have been 17, 18, and then they got to go back and report to the candidate. So you're delegating, your trust. Okay, fine. But imagine if you could just, everyone could get access to the same blob of evidence, and they could write their own software. Now, obviously it's ridiculous to imagine everyone writing their own cryptographic software, but the point is that anyone can, or you can at least, I think as a campaign, work with some consulting to actually write your own software with some, expertise that you maybe bring in, which is again what people do for other things. Write the software, run the blob of evidence through your software, and then if it finds something, then you can point to the place where you think something went wrong, and then there can be a conversation about it. And it might just be, well, you have a bug in your verification software, you got to fix it. Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. Or it's like, this doesn't add up, and something's wrong here.
It happens in some of the experiments that we've seen with end-to-end verifiability, where it does produce the record along with a paper ballot. There was earlier last year, there was a recount, and it was one ballot off, and they were trying to figure out where the ballot mistake came from. It was just a ballot recount. It was put in the wrong pile. That was it. Yeah. But because they had both the evidentiary trails, they didn't even need to conduct an RLA or risk limiting audit or any sort of a deep investigation. They just simply ran the numbers again. They figured out where the discrepancy came from, and that was it. But it was this was due to the crypt.
This was an end-to-end verifiable.
Yeah, end-to-end verifiable. They matched the cryptographic receipts against the paper ballots, and it was one count off. It was just a simple recount issue. That was it.
So you're talking about Microsoft Election Guard.
Yeah, within Fulton. It was somebody had put the wrong ballot in the wrong stack. Yeah. Versus the cast and the spoiled ballots.
People put one ballot in the wrong stack all the time in elections. It happens to be that it doesn't typically overturn election results, but little things like that happen all the time in elections. Any election, anyone who's worked a poll will tell you that like small things always happen. I mean, we're just worried about like big, like election changing results. But yeah, I mean, there's irregularities. I mean, and certainly certainly in the US, the polls get pretty wild sometimes, and you get some interesting issues with people coming in, and there's all the it's yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, imagine that you could have that level of granularity where you're like finding one ballot and getting it back to the right spot. I mean, that's oftentimes something that a conventional paper ballot election, which has human error in it, but that's already better. So I mean, if I could imagine what elections might look like many years from now, after we're long gone, and hopefully we're still having elections, because I think I think the democratic like sort of way is deeply integral to the evolution of our just society, like species. Like it's just that I don't really see like a future that's a good future where we don't have this. I don't really see something supplanting it that's better.
Not even a benevolent AI?
Yeah. Don't get me started. But yeah, anyone who's interested should read the Isaac Asimov short story franchise, in which the benevolent AI gathers up all of the votes that people cast and then tries to interpret what the electorate really meant and then declares the result. So that, I mean, who knows? But in the future, long time from now, blue sky, what does it look like? I'd like to think that we figured out something about, like online voting, if not for like everyone all the time, at least for certain situations where balance of probabilities, it just makes sense. Remote communities, people that are like physically distant, people who can't make it because of certain reasons, pandemics like coming back and throwing everything into disarray, people with accessibility needs who are just like more comfortable voting from home. There are issues with remote voting, coming down to sort of like, having to deal with your family being present or other people being present, or maybe selling your vote or something. But those issues do exist in vote by mail, and we are offering vote by mail even in Canada. Like Elections Canada even is offering it. So, so in my community, everyone's interested in what they call coercion resistance. And so, you talk about remote voting, and they say, coercion, and grandpa can stand over your shoulder and force you to vote. And it's like, well, yeah, that's true. And I have anecdotal, like I've talked to people who allege this, their candidates, or their constituents coming to them, telling them stories about this. But it's also not, I would say, super widespread. And we also are doing it already anyway. So, like, what are you going to do? I mean, we're offering remote voting in the United States. There was widespread remote voting. It was remote mail-in voting. But there is a lot of...
Well, there's nothing stopping an in-person doing it, the in-person, famously in 2015, in the race between Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, and Thomas Mulcair for the NDP in Canada, they had numerous people posting on social media the pictures of their ballots saying, "I voted." It was a big thing. I spoke on CBC about what my sense was, because we were really engaged with that particular election. And I said, look, from what I'm seeing, again, nonpartisan and all that, but people are highly invested in this because it's such a visceral election. They really are. There's an emotional attachment to voting a particular candidate out, and they were sharing it. They had a trending hashtag on Twitter about "I voted" and what they, displaying their intention publicly. There's nothing stopping a parent or anybody to say, take a picture of your ballot in the voting location and prove that that's the ballot you sent in. There's no real way around it. I know Estonia has that method for their remote system where up until the actual election day, you can go in and change your vote online numerous times, and then you confirm it, or it's locked in after a certain period of time, but you can go in person and do it. But you have to think, like, if there is a familiar or a family member or vested interest dedicated to manipulating that vote, there's almost nothing you can do to stop that person from doing so. Like, they're going to do it if it's that meaningful to them.
Yeah, and so like anything in voting, we're not interested in stomping it out entirely, because the cost of stomping it out entirely is typically so great that it just breaks everything else. We're interested in mitigating it to the degree that it's not going to let people assume office who weren't legitimately elected, or allow lists of people to be compiled based on their voting like activity, right? So right now in the United States, a lot of states publish voter rolls like openly. You just go download them. And it's the person's name and address and date of birth and what party they were registered for in what election, what primary. Which, like, I mean, just there's a lot of things that they do in the US that I just don't understand. I don't understand how it's like cool to have a big list like that. But now
do you think you could predict who a person's going to vote for by the understanding what primary they voted in?
Well, I mean, I think you can anticipate it. But people are complicated. God bless them. They don't. They're not. They're like, that's, I think, one of the greatest things about interacting with a person as opposed to an AI is that the person's interesting and they're always going to surprise you. But who you registered to vote for, which primary you voted in doesn't mean who you're going to necessarily vote for. I mean, you could imagine people like registering in a different primary to just throw off people's conceptions. I mean, I don't know. But what I'm saying is, okay, imagine that you are collecting votes using an online system, again, like the systems that we've seen actually run in this province, where there's evidence that they can link identities to votes. So I've seen this where the vendor will actually give. So what I'm going to explain here doesn't involve looking at how people voted, but it does involve collecting demographic information about who's using the online system and kind of like what time of day they're using it and sort of like what their demographics are. So there are vendors that will prepare this information and give this to the clerks. Now, the clerks have a vested interest. They have a legitimate interest in knowing who votes when, what demographics, like, do older people vote? What time of day are they voting? If they're using online voting, how many people are doing it? There's a legitimate reason to want to know that information. But the point is that, like, imagine that you take that information and you add to it how they actually voted. So now we have demographics combined with how people actually voted. Now, an individual has a right to ballot secrecy. So under the law, the vendor wouldn't be allowed to just like declare, oh, Matthew voted for this person. That would be illegal. My question, and I've never really seen a good answer to this, is like, would it also be illegal to aggregate that data and then sell it? So, 55% of men between, 30 and 40 voted for this person, like that. I mean, it wouldn't identify an individual, but it also seems very contrary to the democratic principle, but it's not obviously illegal. And so, and I think the thing that I think some of the Ontario clerks maybe don't realize is that, like, this is what every other company does, right? Your cell phone, your bank, your, like your social media network, that's what they do. They collect your demographic data and they pair it together with something that you do, and they aggregate it with like 100 other people, and then they sell that information to whoever wants it. And so it's like a perfectly natural thing to want to do. So, I mean, are we cool with allowing that in the voting world? I would hope maybe not, but I also don't think that maybe people are considering this as a possibility. If we're using online voting and we're not taking steps to say, for example, encrypt it, in a way that isn't just like directly viewable. I mean, we've published research where we've demonstrated that the raw name and ballot selection not only goes to the vendor but passes through the cloud provider, and the cloud provider in some cases is not even like owned by a national company. Like our company in the nation where the elections happen is owned by a foreign company, and it passes through their server and exists in an unencrypted state on the server. It's like, it's like, does nobody care about ballot secrecy? I mean, like, are we not going to like say maybe we should do something about this? Maybe we should use some cryptography to encrypt the ballot, and then maybe we could count up those ballots while they're still encrypted, and then only decrypt the result, and then issue a mathematical proof that we didn't do anything. There was no funny stuff. That is like 100% legit. If only there was a way to do that.
It's interesting. Like building a voting system, I think it's an interesting approach because it's completely antithetical to typical system design. You want data. You want to be able to measure everything. You want to be able to measure the usage, the click-throughs, everything, every aspect of functionality on whatever service you're providing. Becomes valuable from a number of different data points. But in voting, it's your data adverse. You're actually, the less data you hold, the better off you are, because the less mission critical it's going to be in the event of an attack or breach. So when you're looking at designing a system, you want to figure out the best way to basically eliminate. I use the term like wash your hands, but this time quite literally, wash your hands of any responsibility to house that data. So when you approach it, there's famously like data in transit versus data at rest. Data at rest is vulnerable. It's going to be something that is sitting there as a target. And can you design a system that is impenetrable to manipulation on a data at rest for data at rest? And in the sunburst hack that we've all seen recently, I think the answer is officially no at this point. No, there is no system that you can design. You can talk about immutable data structures or what have you, but there's no system that you can design foolproof that will never be vulnerable to a breach or manipulation. And so if the idea is pass a data system through data in transit, do not store it or get it offline. And like to speak of sunburst again, like you're seeing this right now in the energy companies, you're seeing this right now in the government cloud servers where they're decoupling themselves from the public internet because you simply cannot have these things connected to each other. Famously in voting systems, the narrative has always been, let's not connect them to the internet because the vulnerability of them being manipulated exists, whether it be through whatever, exploits, etc. But in an online system, you're inherently putting yourself into a vulnerable state by connecting it to the internet and passing these votes through a system. Your discussion right there about having a cryptographic proof to both secure, tabulate, and then provide the assurance to the voter that the ballot is being accurately counted is just one element of it. But like the other stuff you were talking about, the voter identification, the demographical information, all of these other data points are equally as valuable, but they're also equally as prone to breach and mitigate, hacking, etc. So it's from a vendor's perspective, if I could design an ideal system, I wouldn't want any data other than the receiving, who's getting the message and where it's coming from in an anonymized state. That would be like the ideal system. Whatever happens in between those two functions is completely between the voter and the respondent voting service.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the ways to protect data is not to collect it to begin with.
Yeah, exactly.
This is like, I mean, this is something that Edward Snowden says, and I think it's worth everyone hearing, which is that the concern is not, when it comes to data, it's not oftentimes it's not how the data is being used. It's that it's being collected to begin with. And so when you talk about a cryptographic end-to-end verifiable proof, it's actually an interesting kind of like middle ground, because you're collecting the data, but it's in an unusable state to you, the vendor, unusable, usable for the core function, but unusable for other non-agreed upon functions. And so that's really kind of what I think is really interesting. It's an interesting compromise between, kind of like locking down how the data is used and not collecting it to begin with. You're kind of like in some kind of quantum superposition or something like that.
Yeah, that's one way to put it, but it's kind of true, right? Like you're handed this immense responsibility of securing the democratic principles of society by facilitating the vote. And I think, like, speaking to election officials, they do put a lot of onus on that. Like, it's not just I'm running an election, it's my job, it's part of my job responsibilities. They do see themselves, they take it very seriously. Like some clerks take it extremely seriously in facilitating safe and secure voting. Especially coming into this, I remember speaking to a clerk who was so proud about being able to offer a polling station in a homeless shelter, because that particular subset of the community was typically disenfranchised from the voting process. And they were like, we really pushed for it. We were able to get, somebody to go in there and get their votes heard. And it was, it's interesting because it's something you never think about. You're always focused on security or accessibility or all these other things.
Yeah.
But it's those little initiatives that they take so, take so severely that really kind of shed light into how an election official manages the entire election process, or how they see this as being ran.
Oh yeah.
I think.
Yeah. And I mean, to be fair to them, they're dealing with 100 problems, right?
Oh,
if you're a municipal clerk, or even a chief electoral officer whose only job is elections. I mean, a lot of municipal clerks, elections are just one of their job. They've got 100 things on their plates, and here I am, and I've got one thing on mine. I'm a specialist, and so it's easy for me to talk about one thing. And you're right, like these kind of these social initiatives. I mean, they do good work, and I think they deserve recognition. I mean, all the people in elections that work in elections who've worked to poll, they all deserve recognition. It's kind of like, we're being an election official is a little bit like being a Canadian. It's like you're just focused on doing a job, and you're not really interested in getting credit for it. And you probably won't get credit for it. You have your own beach at D-Day, and you never make it into any of the movies. It's kind of like how it is. But that's why election officials, I think, are just some of my favorite people, just because they're I don't want to say like they're doing God's work exactly, but I mean, in some sense they are. They're keeping our society running and keeping it fair. They don't get credit for it. They deserve.
The way I see it is the way I see it, especially in what just happened down south, they are the arbiters of the transfer of power from one group to another, or the same, the one from one point in history to another. And the significance of that, I don't think, can be understated. And as much as we analyze both your circle and from a vendor's perspective, we're trying to figure out how to make how to do business with them, how to make their job easier, et cetera, or how to provide a valuable service to them. And then your circle coming in and saying, like, how can we make this better? What issues do we need to be taking a look at from an analytical point of view? They're doing an immense amount of work. They're handling an immense amount of responsibility, and a lot of times they don't get any sort of credit for what their sort of that immensity of responsibility actually is.
It's kind of worse than that, at least in this past election, because a lot of the election officials that I know in the U.S. Were either directly getting death threats. Or at least getting a lot of like actual just hate, and I mean like haters hate, like people calling them up and just screaming at them, and like I'm not exaggerating. There's one election official I know. He said that he wished his mom was still there around so she could go and like give these give these bullies like a piece of, like a grown man, and just feeling kind of, just sort of overwhelmed by the hatred, for lack of a better word. Some of these people. Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, this is somebody that's been respected in our community, well before any of this has happened. And I remember she had armed protesters come to her house, and of course we know that there was that plot to kidnap the Michigan governor. And then there was the armed insurrection at the Michigan State House. I mean, like, we live next door to Michigan, and it's like, I don't recognize like, these are our next door neighbors, and like, I don't recognize any of this. This is just not acceptable. None of it's acceptable. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm putting my Canadian values onto the United States, but like, maybe I'm just being old fashioned, but guns don't belong in legislatures unless you're with the sergeant at arms. If you're a protester, you shouldn't be bringing guns into a state house. And if you're a congressman, I mean, I don't know, or at least let's like make it Canadian. If you're a parliamentarian, you shouldn't be bringing a concealed carry into the chamber. It's just like guns in the chamber. I mean, it's just like, what are you doing? Like, it's not right. And going to people's houses and calling them up and giving them death threats. I mean, there were vendors whose staff had to have security protection. I mean, it's not right. I mean,
no, it gets pretty serious. Like, speaking to my colleagues on my side, it's not understated. They're actually concerned, because you never know what the worst case scenario is going to be until it's right in front of you. And what happened last week when the election was being challenged. You talked about giving a speech at a municipal conference a while back, just when the election was concluded, and there was sort of this in-between limbo state. Everyone, people were more concerned about other major topics, because everyone was like, it can't get any worse. Like, they kind of expected people to kind of, complain about it, but no one would have imagined that the Capitol in Washington was going to be overrun with insurgents, and people were going to die because of this thing. That's where I think the significance really comes in, where this is the worst case. We've seen it now. Like,
it's not the.
Okay, maybe.
No, come on, man.
You
talked about Estonia earlier. You want to talk about worst case? What if your neighbor rolls in with tanks, takes all the military of your country, sends them to gulags, they all get shot. And then they occupy your country for 50 years. Maybe that's not even the worst case. Look at Germany in World War II. I mean, I've lived in Germany. It's like so it's not a worst case, but what it is it is a kind of what's the term? Like, kind of bursting your bubble,
Catalyst.
I remember what it does. So, like, what happened last week, I think I'm still shocked over. I'm like really upset. Like, it just like, it was just so upsetting to watch. And I also am just, like, frankly kind of angry. Like, how dare these people, I mean, they have concerns. I think that there's a lot of reason to believe that their concerns are kind of, there's some issues there, but like, I mean, come on. So, but what happened was, a number of years ago, there was a gunfight in the Canadian Parliament, and I remember, like, that really shocked me to sort of think, because I like, one of the reasons I'm in voting is because I love the idea of people being able to talk through their stuff, exactly because, like, my family, and I think most people's family, at least if you have, like a European ancestry, like came out of the ashes of World War II. I'm very upset about World War II. I'm still very mad about World War II. And I kind of don't want to see that kind of, just that evil unleashed in the world again. And, there were people that saw what happened in the Capitol that described it as like, they were like literally watching evil. And I remember when there was a guy who had like some kind of HD like helmet cam, and he was right at the speaker's gallery when the woman was shot. and it was like full HD, and it was like a 40-minute long feed, uncut, just like from the out on the lawn all the way inside. I watched the whole thing, and I got to say, I really did feel the evil. I did feel it. It was like I don't know what I was witnessing, but I didn't recognize it, and it just felt really wrong. But I also remember when that happened in the Canadian Parliament, like there was a bubble that kind of burst in my mind, because I just assumed that, that like our Parliament wouldn't have something like that happen. Of course, then you read the history and you realize that there was like an attempted bombing, a number of years prior. And so, violence happens in legislature sometimes, and it's awful. But I think one of the things about what happened with the Canadian Parliament is that they were basically back the next day working, and with Congress, they were back that evening working, and they went back to it. And, you go to the Parliament in Germany, and, there's like, like the whole thing was like just shot up, like with bullets and stuff. And you could still see some of those marks, and they kind of like preserve some of that history there, just to sort of remind themselves of where things can go and how bad things can get. And, like I say, I've lived in Germany, and like I've seen, like I've seen the Berlin Wall. I visited East Germany once when I was a kid. And so I've seen it like firsthand. And it like, I was like, I don't know, I was like 5 or something. And I remember it. Like it left an impression on me, man. It was not something that like I knew was wrong. And I remember when I was a kid watching on TV, I was like living back in Canada, watching the wall come down. And it was like, I remember just being really glad. And it's like, so, and then I went to Germany again when I was older, and I was working there. I did an internship there, and I remember walking along the line. They have a line embossed in the sidewalk where the wall used to be. I remember just walking along it, like in my 20s, just saying like that, like it's it's just this thing that's here. And Germany's just gotten on with the business of just living, and they've really, so one thing Germany's really done, I think, well, is like stared inside of themselves and really confronted it, right? Like none of this like, oh yeah, it was bad, but like, oh, can't we have unity? It's like, well, like, no, let's actually look into the mirror really hard and never forget what happened. And so I think point is, I think there's cause for hope, but I am more, I mean, we're recording this before the inaugurations happen, so we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if this is going to keep sliding further. I don't know. I really hope
it's interesting to think like that too. I was talking to a person, and it was right before the Capitol, it was like Wednesday morning or something. He's like, oh, President Trump's giving a speech. And like as we were on the phone, and I was like, oh yeah, he's like, you watching? I'm like, no, I'm not watching it. And we went and did our own thing. And then we touched base a few days ago, and I was like, oh, I forget that so much has happened in between those two periods that the conversation was completely different than what we were anticipating. But I don't know. I think right now it's definitely a time to rethink how we're doing this. It's kind of weird, and like, I don't know how you feel about everything, but it's weird to feel a bit vindicated that you were at least understanding of the issues a while ago. I think to your credit, and to mine as well, like, you looked at something a while ago, you saw the issues coming, and there is, I think, a little bit of credit is due for that. At least somebody was acknowledging the issues ahead of time.
Well, I appreciate, I do appreciate that, and I am trying to call these things as I see them. But I mean, as far as like vindication goes, I mean, like I was in the press, like in the summer before the 2018 election, saying, what happens if the internet goes down on election night? What's your disaster plan? And the clerks were saying, well, we don't have a disaster plan. And then it did go down on election night. And it's not like any of the clerks like said, oh yeah, I guess you were right. Maybe we should do that. Maybe, but don't worry. We are going to, not that we're going to like, listen to you exactly, but we're going to listen to the idea, and we're going to have a disaster plan this time around. I mean, I'm not hearing that. Maybe they're doing it. I don't know. I mean, it's, whatever.
I think that's just growth for anything though. And like going back earlier, we were talking about the clerks and the immensity of their job. And not just clerks, but election management bodies in general. you said it yourself. You're a specialist. You clearly identify issues. You come in and try to relay that to them. Some of them took heed and implemented it and listened to what you had to say and listened to your community, what you had to say. Others, chose to do their own thing, and that's fine, because it's all a learning curve. And the reality is, and like coming from a company's perspective, it's a new technology. This is a brand new.
Yeah.
I like to think this is the last, what do you want to call it? Battle, I guess, in tech. It's one of the only things you really can't move forward. As we sit here and we're like, you said it earlier, you can shop, you can get healthcare online. My doctor is remote now. My bank is remote. Everything's remote. My kids, they go to school remotely. Voting is still the last thing where people are kind of like, wait a minute, we can't do that just yet. But the reality is, it's an inevitability. It always was. It's just, how are you going to implement it? And I think, in summary of what happened down in the US, the issues that happened in 2018 in Canada, the issues that happened in other jurisdictions when they were interested in this particular technology, it's a learning curve. It's something you take the lessons, you take what's happened, you put it into context, and you improve the system through refinement and better understanding of what the real issues were. You said it yourself. You were complaining about or critiquing this particular issue, somebody contesting an election. You never would have thought that it was going to come out in this particular shape. And I think that, moving forward, people have a better understanding of that.
Once the election fraud conspiracy talk began around this time, a little, maybe like kind of more like March last year, once that started, I was like, okay, this is going to be an issue. And I like, so at that was the moment where I realized, it doesn't matter if there was fraud. If this person loses the election, this is going to be what the narrative is, because it can be, right? There's no cost. The Senate, and the Congress, the House, that doesn't really place a high cost on saying things that aren't true. And until they start actually making it cost something to say something that's not true, then there'll be just, there'll be no cost for it, there'll be no consequence, and there's nothing to stop the next person from coming in. And maybe the next person will be more savvy, and it'll be harder to recognize. What is this line from Chernobyl? Valery Legasov, what is the cost of lies, right? I don't know if that was his historical quote, but certainly in the show, it's that you hear enough lies, you just can't recognize the truth anymore. And it's like, I remember sitting there kind of like saying that, I'd just be like muttering that to myself, like drinking a coffee in the kitchen. What is the cost of lies? And so as soon as like we started hearing this, I knew that. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm some kind of oracle. And I saw that there was going to be an insurrection. I did not see the insurrection at the Capitol. I did not see the violence coming. I mean, that's always like, I can tell you, I can, just like, again, looking back to World War II and stuff, violence is always on the table in terms of like what the history might record. But it was shocking. But I've seen this kind of thing before Trump, if the election doesn't go the way I want it to, we're going to take a hard look at it. Maybe not in the same dramatic fashion, but that's this is kind of a partisan thing that you do see that. So as long as people that are like buying into this are kind of able to sort of self-reflect and run the self-diagnostic and sort of say, am I in this for a partisan reason, or am I in it for a genuine democratic reason? And if it's just like, there's this great YouTube video series called Conversations with My 2-year-old daughter, reenacted by a 40-year-old man. And it's basically exactly that. It's like a dad and he has these interactions with his daughter, and then like he takes those actual things, those things that she says, and then has a grown man reenact them. And it's just ridiculous. So one of the favorite ones, I think it's like episode 1, and the guy comes in, he's reenacting this 2-year-old, 3-year-old daughter, and he's got like fairy wings on and a tutu and stuff. And then he's looking through the cupboards because he wants a cookie. And then the dad's like, you can't have any more cookies. And it's just like, okay. but I was just thinking I could have another cookie. And it's like, no, you can't have more cookies. Yeah, but I want another cookie, you know? And it's like, it reminds me of that sketch a little bit, not to like in any way downplay the seriousness of this, but it's just like this kind of phenomenon of like, I just think maybe I won the election. It's like, no, you didn't win the election. It's like, yeah, but I want to have won the election. I mean, you know, again, that's a serious thing. Like we need to have some kind of way to kind of identify this and sort of put a ring around it and just say, this is not what happened. You know?
I think that's kind of the summary of everything.
Want it to have happened.
But that's just it, though. I think moving forward, like I said, lessons learned. You know, like what are we all taking away from this? I'm taking away the belief that transparency in an election system, from a vendor's perspective, as much as humanly possible, is more than mission critical. It's absolutely fundamental now to running elections. Because I don't think this is going to change. I think you're going to your comment about people, you know, having the self-reflection and looking inward and deciding whether or not this is a partisan initiative, partisan manipulation is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. That's not. You can't solve that problem. I think that's too wide in scope. I think what we can do, though, is put forward a solution that really that provides them two things. One, it either provides them evidence of any manipulation that they can then discover, and then they're vindicated. The other thing it provides to them is something to keep them busy looking through for a period of time while the rest of the world keeps going. And if they find anything, they can bring it up. But in that interim period, they can go through the evidence, they can go through the ballots, they can conduct their own research, just like the flat earthers do. And maybe someone discovers that the earth was in fact flat and it was turtles all the way down, or there was, or that nothing happened and in fact the election was run completely successfully and the right candidate won based on our democratic principles. I think that's pretty much it at this point. The idea of changing society inherently is I don't know. I don't think that's possible.
It's like saying, people probably shouldn't do a lot of things. People should eat a good diet and they just don't. But, I think it's like,
we're all guilty of not eating a good diet, I think.
Your role is obviously not to say that, but I think that, like, for me as a sort of professor, I worked for like almost 40 years to get tenure to then be able to start talking truth and not sort of have to kind of like moderate the truth for political purposes, right? To, sort of save my job or whatever. Right? I just think that what I saw in the US demands to be called out for what it was, which was a bad faith effort for partisan. I mean, within that effort, there might be some good faith that deserves to be discussed. And I'm not saying that you can't criticize an election process, right? But if you're going to criticize an election result, you got to understand that it's going to be damaging. And I do think that it needs to get called out, especially for the laziness, especially for the sloppiness, and especially for the demonstrably partisan nature of the attack. Somebody's got to call it out. And I mean, it's got to be. But I think you're right. And about what your takeaway is, which is that I don't know, call it I love this line from Jack Daniels. He says, "Every day we make it the best we can." Right. So that's really what we're talking about here. Is like, well, we can't solve the birthers and the flat earthers and everything, but we can make it the best we can. We can provide evidence. And so that's all we can do is just get down to the business of providing evidence and hope that like truth and good faith prevails. I guess we can't solve the bad faith and the cost of lies, but we can work on making things better than they are now. And there's definitely things that we can do. I mean, we already know what we can do to make it better. At least here in Canada. I mean, I can't make I have no ability to help or to change the US in any way, but I can certainly help Canada to sort of move in the right direction. And
I think this is it. Like, this is the an event occurred in reflection. We're sort of looking back on it now and deciding how to interpret it and make the adjustments. And I think we can do it. I think unfortunately, I think this was a necessary evil that kind of needed to emerge.
Burst some bubbles.
It had, yeah, again, right? It's in economics, it's the same thing. You never look at anything with clear eyes until something happens that really solidifies it in your head. It's there's no words for what happened down in the US. It was honestly, I spent about 2 days, I could barely do any work because I was just watching the whole event unfold and what was going to happen. And of course, like, we both have colleagues that are involved in these processes, so it was a heartfelt event for sure.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to. So like I watched September 11th happen in real time, and I don't want to compare the loss of life from September 11th, because it's just like numerically, it's not the same. But just the feeling that I had of horror, it was like, it did remind me of that feeling of horror that I had on September 11th, watching that happen, and just realizing that, as you point out, something big just happened, and that things are going to change, hopefully for the better, but something's going to change, I hope, because it's just intolerable to imagine that happening again. Like,
I think the fact that it was a attack on democracy, and as somebody, I think we both in our respective fields put democracy, we hold it to high esteem. To have that direct assault against everything that we both work towards, I can appreciate that. And just from my perspective, it's like, this was a direct assault against the country itself, and how in the institutions, whether it's Republican, the attackers were very clear in their disagreement with both Republicans and Democrats. They were screaming, "Hang Mike Pence." It was a horrible event. I can only imagine how those politicians felt while they were cowering inside there. It was like watching, I witnessed in real time the Virginia Tech shooting, online. And you got that same sense of assault and horror that happened last week. And, I don't know, that's the way I feel about it. I'm taking away from it a lesson learned that we can,
so when you talk about
it a bit better.
An assault on democracy, it's interesting to point out that there's this sort of saying, and I don't know if it's true 100% of the time, but it's true the bulk of the time, which is that democracies typically don't go to war with other democracies. The times that Canada's gone to war has been really about attacks on democracy, right? World War II is, I think, the example that stands out in mind. So you have to ask yourself, how big of a deal is an attack on democracy? Well, the history, at least of this country, has been that it's such a big deal that it's the one thing that you might, as a country, go to war over. Not that anyone's going to war like over what happened at the Capitol, but just the notion of an attack. It's the cornerstone of our society, as the Supreme Court of Canada calls it. I mean, I don't want to like sound like some kind of flag waving person, and get all sort of sappy about it, but it really matters a lot. And I mean, other things in life matter, like a lot of other things in life matter. But, when people say, well, why are you so focused on like democratic issues? Why aren't you focused on like social justice and other, issues of equality and so forth? And yeah, those are really important things. And guess what? If you don't have democracy, you can't have those conversations. And just look at any other authoritarian regime that exists in Canada or in the world right now, and ask what kind of social justice conversations they're having, what kinds of equality conversations they're having. So, I would say let people have those conversations, and certainly let people like us, work on trying to keep things, keep the thing from flying apart, so that we can keep having those conversations. Democracy is messy, but man, I don't know what else to do. Like, there's nothing else.
What's that phrase? Democracy is the best form of government.
It's the worst form of government,
except for
all the others, right?
Yeah,
it's classic Churchill, right? And it's so true. I've tried to think of if I could like come up with a version of that that's sort of more on the nose, and I can't. It's Churchill. Just he's got it. So.
Well, let's see what happens in the future. We've got another week ahead of us before the inauguration.
Yeah, so the good news is that to anyone listening, to anyone who's made it this deep down the rabbit hole and this far into the video, just understand that it doesn't end with the inauguration. It's not like this. It's not over. It's never over. We actually are in a transformative time in the history of the world, especially with the degree of online voting that's happening in Canada right now. And there are things coming on the horizon that might be bad, not bad to the degree that we've seen probably, but hopefully not, but things we got to deal with. And we got to have something that when it does go wrong, that we can say, well, look, this is why it went wrong. And this is what we've got something right here to fix it. What can we do? Hopefully we can fix it and kind of prepare for it now. But you've done a lot of work, I think, in that regard. I think 10 years ago I couldn't imagine maybe sitting down with a vendor to talk about cryptographic end-to-end verification in a fulsome way, in an honest, straightforward way, not using the language of cryptographic end-to-end verification, but actually doing it, actually partnering with Microsoft and some of the Benelow's arguably the founder of this paradigm. And your company's working with Microsoft to sort of bring this vision to life in the election space. And so, I'm glad to see somebody doing it. Somebody has to do it, So
I think I've said this to you before, but we're carrying the torch that Benelo and others have kind of been carrying themselves for a long time. You ran the first end-to-end verified election in Canada, I believe, and so it's I kind of feel
the University of Ottawa.
It's a big honor. Significant honor.
Punch Scan. That was so Punch Scan was a very humble beginning. We ran the Graduate Students Union election with that. It was a 2-page ballot with holes punched in the top sheet and bingo daubers to mark the ballot. And as you can imagine, bingo dauber ink really messes up with flatbed optical scanners. And we learned a lot. And then we ran elections in Tacoma Park, Maryland. This technology has been around and it's been sort of under the surface for a while, but not for lack of anything except for a lack of understanding why it's needed. That you can't run an internet election if you're not going to provide any evidence. I mean, well, certainly you can, and certainly we are seeing that.
Yeah, I was going to say, we can do anything. I always like to use the analogy that in Ontario, there's nothing stopping me from attaching votes to carrier pigeons and sending them away. It's interesting.
Oh, yeah, because the Municipal Elections Act doesn't really define anything about alternative.
I could do anything I want. I could put it on a golden retriever's collar and have it run house to house collecting votes. There's absolutely nothing preventing me from offering the service.
If anyone in the Ontario Municipal Affairs and Housing Ministry is watching, probably not. But if you are, and you want to have something important for your legislative agenda, instead of taking away people's ability to use ranked choice ballots, maybe you can give them something by writing in a requirement that says that you can't do an election inside of a black box, like abstractly speaking, a black box where votes go in and totals come out and you have no idea what happened in the middle. I mean, that should just be we shouldn't I don't know why anyone's okay with this. The only thing I can think of is that people don't understand that that's what's happening.
Well, I said, right, the clerks have immense responsibilities in dealing with them now. I think in their defense, it wasn't really an issue but I think it is now. I think it's top of mind. It's like ransomware.
I haven't
Ransomware was
seen
been
any
around
clerks
for.
talking about this. Well, that's not true. I have seen clerks talk about this, but up until the Capitol, I mean, so we were knee deep in it in November and December. We were already knee deep in the conspiracies and the anger, and Elections Canada was taking phone calls about the conspiracies, and they had to tweet, and then the president retweeted Elections Canada, and it was like a big, we already were in it. But what I have seen up until I haven't talked to any clerks since the Capitol insurrection, but they kind of like, they were aware that there was this kind of like simmering anger, but they were sort of more interested, like their big topic was like COVID polling, which
For sure.
it's important. COVID polling, how do we physically distance, or what do we do? Is there an alternative to having in-person polling? Okay, important topic, but it's not like a burning dumpster fire, like what, and then now a violent tragedy. And look at that poll: 1 in 5 Canadians from a specific party, and I'm not going to name, that are carrying these views around with them. And what kind of swamp gas is going to bubble up next time? So we got it. So I hope you're right. I want you to be right. I want this to be the thing that changes the conversation onto the right things. Now I don't know what else it's going to take. What else is it going to take for us to?
No, I think this is definitely this is the demarcation line. This is the point, I think, where people are looking at this from where understanding evidence, I think, is the key word moving forward. Everything had their hot button issue when COVID hit. Voting became remote. Everything became remote. As an online voting vendor, we all of a sudden became very interesting to a lot of people because it was, the solution it can solve a lot of our problems. At this point now, it's okay. Hey, COVID, I could understand in November being the hot issue, but now it's like, oh, what happens if these politicians or candidates contest the election? Again, before it was just a theory and almost expected because everyone knew that particular candidate in the U.S. would be contesting the election. He said it himself directly. It was a completely unexpected result. But now it's that poll that you were speaking about earlier, I think really does illustrate that, like, hey, maybe we're not immune to this up here. Maybe this is something that we need to kind of build in, and
yeah,
people are inherently reactive, and now they have something to react to.
I think that at least that you deserve some credit for talking about these issues before what happened last week. I mean, you were taking concrete steps, and like, for anybody's watching, I'm not being paid to say that. We don't have any, I'm not a shareholder in Neuvote. Okay. But I think the fact is that you were building in things. And I mean, I'm not going to comment on, like, I haven't looked at your stuff to know if like what degree it's like sufficient, but in terms of just what was on your mind, this idea of like, what can we do to finally confront head on the like concerns about online voting, because there are other vendors out there right now who, the way that when they receive criticism for sort of how their software works, their response is to hit the researchers back. Either just say that they don't dismiss them, they don't understand the system. And I'm speaking about a specific vendor, and then or straight up just discredit them. I'm speaking of another vendor, sort of attacking them outright and just sort of saying they don't understand. And it's like, that's just the wrong approach. The cybersecurity community isn't going away. Presumably online voting isn't going away. And so there's got to be some kind of like meeting of the minds somewhere along the way where we can sort of like, we can still have an adversarial relationship, but like a collegial adversarial relationship where, there's some kind of like, I don't know, select, like, I don't want to say like Darwinian sort of interaction, but where, if you do something dumb, as a vendor, like the academic community can point to it and say, hey, this is not okay. And then the, industry can respond and stop doing it. Right. And so I do think it's worth, sort of like appreciating the fact that you didn't wait until the Capitol Hill insurrection to start like worrying about what's going to happen down the line and start trying to, build a sort of like an approach that would allow, like, I mean, if internet voting is going to happen in a way that's acceptable, I can't think of any other way that it can work other than to have this cryptographic end-to-end verifiability. There's nothing else on the table right now that I can see can really accomplish that. So, I mean,
I agree. Honestly, like when I was looking at I appreciate that consideration, but honestly, I agree with your skepticism and your community skepticism. I refused to do online banking until recently because I was like, I don't trust it. I simply do not trust. My cell phone provider asked me to download their app and run everything off of the app, and they're like, oh, you don't have to call in. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but I'm gonna be real with you. I just don't want to download your app. I'd rather take the extra time to call in rather than have your app sitting on my phone tracking my behavior. In addition to all the other stuff you probably already have about me, it's just inherently skeptical. So when you're looking at elections,
what
skepticism 100%.
What changed your mind about online banking?
The convenience got to me eventually. It was just like, okay, fine.
What do you think changed my mind? Because I bank online, but like I'm like security.
I would assume the security. I would assume a security past a certain threshold where you felt comfortable enough to do it. No.
What it is reassurance that if I am hacked, that they're going to take care of me, right? That's like back in the 90s when the web was just starting out, they didn't even have TLS. Like SSL was still a glimmer in Netscape's eye. Like that the credit card companies were like, wow, we want you guys to bank online because we'll make a ton of money. But back in those days, and I remember, I mean, I was like, I wasn't grown up, but I mean, I was around that like kind of computing world. Was that they said, okay, we're going to have to give people confidence that if something goes wrong, like they're going to know, and we're going to be able to fix it. And so that's what we got to, so that's where things like purchase protection come into play and all this kind of stuff. And so, I mean, I remember, what was it that I bought? So my wife bought something the other day, and we were worried about like, well, what happens if blah, 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 what happens if this happens? And then we're like, well, if it breaks, and like we have this like purchase protection plan, they're going to take care of it. So, I don't have to worry about all this stuff because I know that if it goes wrong, well,
they had other safeguards built into it too. Look at PCI compliance. Like they inherently had to build in proper procedures and security standards to develop all of this stuff. That's what I mean about online voting, and it's funny enough. I remember about years ago, I think when we first met, it was the wild west. And I really did feel like that's what we were coming into. It was the unfettered, new frontier for tech. There's nothing stopping me from doing anything. It was people just coming to the table with all these different solutions or ideas, and it was really interesting. If I wanted to start an online payment processor, I would have to sit down and follow whatever procedures are already in place to roll that out, e-commerce site, etc. For this thing though, it was literally just like the final frontier. What are we going to do? What are we going to do next? And I think that's really what one aspect of what attracted me to this. It was a real technological challenge. It was interesting, and but as we've kind of gone through, I understand the necessity for standards and sort of aggregation of thought leadership in this particular space, because when things go wrong, they can go really wrong. And even from a vendor, like when things go wrong in this industry, for anyone watching, just to let you guys know, the vendors do talk to each other. And when things go wrong, we're always like, ooh, it's like, everyone on the football team, only one person may be the quarterback, and that quarterback gets arrested for something. Everyone else on the football team's like, oh, you know, did you see what happened to Tommy over there? Like, it's pretty bad. That's the sense, right? Like, this was an interesting field, and I think, like what you said earlier, I think at this point now, in reflection about what to do moving forward, I think there is sort of like a meeting of the minds that needs to occur between the vendors, the academics, the cybersecurity researchers, et cetera, to really bring together the best case solution here, because this thing can't exist in the different silos anymore. Like, it just can't. I think, you know, I've seen a little bit of headway. I know there's another in-person online voting company, or not online, but in-person voting company in the U.S. that's making some footsteps to kind of build a bridge to the academic side. I think that's, you know, it's a good start, and I would like to, you know, I'd definitely like to see other companies and other stakeholders, government, et cetera, follow us along and kind of building that bridge and try to figure out how to do this the best way we can. For sure.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think kind of maybe in some sense what we're doing right now is I think we're culture building, and I think the laws reflect the culture. So it's you know, it's like you can't just make a bunch of standards and then, I mean, well, I guess you can make a bunch of standards and enforce the standards or whatever, but I mean, you're not going to have that like zeal to enforce the standards or even to write the standards. Like you have seen Nicole Goodman, Professor Goodman, and I like working and spinning our wheels trying to get standards like developed for online voting in Canada for years now. And like we for years we tried to get like the proverbial grown-ups to do this, because it's like I mean I'm a professor. It's not my job to write standards for online voting, but like no one's doing it, so we kind of have to sort of take the bull by the horns and kind of initiate that action. So we're trying to build a culture here, which I think is why we wanted to have a long form conversation. I mean, there's an existing culture in the US, an existing kind of vendor like academic interaction. It's not super positive, and maybe we can do things a little differently up here. I don't know, but I think there's not enough conversation happening in Canada right now around voting, and there needs to be more. And just to the clerks or to the chief electoral officers. I mean, we're here. We're going to be working on this like for years, and we'd love to work with you, and we'd love to make it, fix this issue, get everyone.
Alex, I just want to say, like, because I know we were talking, we basically just said we wanted to do a long form discussion. We didn't know what to call this or anything like that. But I really don't know what the result of this thing would be. But I think if I could say one thing to anybody who's made it this far, and if you have my sincere appreciation for your interest in this. But anybody, academics, if you're a stakeholder, you feel you're a stakeholder who wants to get involved, I would definitely say reach out to Dr. Essex, reach out to myself, reach out to anybody. And I think maybe this is something that can spark an interest in really figuring out, putting together like a global thought leadership in the various contexts, US, Canada, et cetera, on how to, let's do this. I guess if I put a call to action, it's like, hey, we have a couple people having a discussion here about how to make elections better. And if anybody wants to have another discussion about it, by all means.
We've been talking now, what is this, like 3 hours, almost?
Yeah, I was going to say, famously, we're famous for our discussions. My girlfriend asked me earlier, she's like, what do you guys, how long is it going to be? And I'm like, there's one thing I know, it's going to go a long time. Yeah.
And so, that's really one of the things that I really like about voting is there's no shortage of stuff to talk about. It's very it's a very deep field. There's a lot there. I think that we could easily do another 3 hours on another topic in voting. I mean, a lot of like what we've talked about today is just kind of getting off our chest, sort of like the horror of the last week, or the last 3 months. Let's be honest, and what do we do, I think everyone's asking that question right now. I remember, again, after September 11th, like there was this notion of like, there was this like refractory period where everyone was just kind of like processing. what happened. And you know, you remember when somebody would try to crack a joke and it would just be too soon, you know. And I don't know if we have a clear plan of where this is all going to lead. Man, I hope you're right that this is going to kind of, you know, burst some bubbles, wake people up, get people kind of thinking about this. Cause I mean, like, you know, we have talked about this for going back several years now, you know, at eVote ID in Austria, you know, at the AMCTO here in Ontario. You know, we've been talking about this going on like since before 2018 election, like this kind of stuff. I mean, we've been talking about it the whole time.
You know what though? It's like some people are just, you know, their concerns are different. We both are parents. I think, you know, coming from a parental perspective, I couldn't tell you how many times my kids have been like, "Don't do that. It's a bad idea. Just don't do it." And they do it, and then they get hurt. And I'm like, my response is the way I parent. I hope this isn't a strike against me, but I'm always like, "Yeah, I told you. That's why I tell you. You think I'm just talking to myself?" You know, it's I hate to say I told you so, and I don't think that's right in this particular context, but it's you know, okay, now you've learned, the lesson's been learned. We've seen again, I don't want to use the word worst case, but we've seen a severe reaction to some of the issues that have been highlighted over the last few years. And okay, it's called what do we do next? How do we respond to this in kind? You know, like what are we going to take away? What are we going to do? How can we make things better? How can we prevent this from ever happening again? And I think that's, you know.
Well, you know, it is an interesting question. Like, you know, in academia, I, you know, going back to this idea of like, you know, you work all these years, you get tenure, and now you have the ability to, you know, like actually speak truth with a little bit of confidence finally. You know, I remember I went to a municipality one time, and at the request of a counselor and a bunch of locals, and to talk about online voting, but the mayor of this town was not very happy about that, and so the council ended up having to pass a motion to allow me to speak, and some of the council did not want me to be there, and one of the managers of the city, the day after, called the dean of my faculty and said, "Who is this guy? And does he represent the views of the university?" And now I was an assistant professor at the time. And, you know, if you know anything about like academia, you're kind of like in a, you know, pre-tenure, you're in a precarious position. And that's not a cool thing to do, to like call up. And first of all, academics speaking about their research expertise never represent the university unless there's maybe some kind of explicit like mention of it. But like, you know, like my job isn't to, you know, to like, you know, rub a soothing political message over the province. My job is to raise these issues and just hope that somebody somewhere will care enough to help, you know, help us address them. And, you know, we're like, the thing is sometimes, okay, so I have a very good relationship, or not maybe so good of a relationship with different clerks, depending on how much they want or don't want to do online voting. And the one thing that has to keep being said is that, like, you know, like we're all on the same side here. We're all working together. We all want our society to like just flourish, right? Strong democracy allows us to have strong politics, which allows us to have strong civic society, which allows us to, you know, like be able to debate these kind of issues, you know, about justice and social like equality and all of these things that we want for our kids and for our future. So like, how do we do, like, how do we create that, like, how do we build that culture where we're you know, kind of like able to sort of talk to each other? Here's one thing that's different about Canada. The election agencies in Canada are insular. They kind of are like, they kind of keep to themselves.
Oh yeah, very much so.
In the US, you have election officials showing up to like, I mean, I've met more US election officials than I have Canadian election officials, and that's a shame. I would like to reverse that. The election officials I have met, they're awesome, by the way. I've met a bunch of chief electoral officers. They're like my favorite people. I mean, they're great. I would love to spend more time, like in that community in Canada. All of the time that I spend seems to be in the US, because they're the ones that are having these conversations. I mean, now obviously their culture is very contentious. And, when you look at the partisanship, when we're trying to organize conferences, we're trying to get, political people to come and add their voice. It's, like they make some pretty heavy political calculations. Like we try to get it nice and bipartisan. Like in Canada, elections are considered a nonpartisan issue, right? You put your partisanality away when you become an chief electoral officer. You're not even allowed to vote when you become a chief electoral officer, as a symbol of your impartiality, your political neutrality, right? In the U.S., it is partisan. Even the election administrators, there are administrators. So if you're Canadian and you're watching this, there are administrators. The people that are running the election will run for re-election in their own election that they're administering. They will both be a candidate and an administrator of an election. Which
I can see that producing some sort of issue.
From a Canadian lens, it's just like a very it's a very unusual thing and whatever. But like the EAC is not nonpartisan. They're bipartisan. So like they actually reserve seats for commissioners specifically to be there's a Republican seat that's opening. So we got to go get a Republican appointee for the commission. It's just a different way of doing business. So it leads to some negativity in the community, but they are out there having these conversations. National Association of Secretaries of State, Election Verification Network. What are, like I'm blanking out here. There's a bunch of these.
Well, you have other ones. You have the observer organizations. You have IFES, the OCSE or OSCE, I think.
Yeah, IFES International. Yeah, League of Women. Yeah. Like there's so many of these organizations that meet, that have conferences that are out there. We need this. And so we in Ontario, we got the AMCTO, where all the clerks come together and they talk about stuff. And I've had the opportunity to speak to them many times. But what happens at these US conferences is that like you can actually go after the break and in the hallway and talk to them, and they make themselves available, and that's really kind of where we got to get to. Here is where we're having these kind of conversations, like God willing, we all get the vaccine. We can all like go and be in a room together. I was joking about how I was having dreams over Christmas about going to that election conference that we've been to in Austria. And then I woke up and I had to spend Christmas, without seeing my mom and my dad, and how, it was kind of like the dream was more real than the waking life, So maybe kind of, by October, we're in a position where we can, have that conference in person again. I don't know, but, and actually start building that culture, like the culture building, let it start now today.
I can agree with that 100%. I think if we take away anything from this, like you and I think I think these discussions are worthy to be had. And like, it's kind of interesting that we, because we've talked offline about this stuff, and our idea to take this in a public forum, I think is important. And I think it's an olive branch to, like I said, everyone else who would like to maybe take part or continue this. Because there's all these great conversations that are being had by everyone, and you're right, typically they're happening at the conferences, in the hallways or whatever. And to speak about like transparency and what happened in the US, I think this is a way to sort of provide that light. I mentioned earlier, part of the issue with those vendors being challenged in the US was historically they were not wrong to be challenged. There was a shroud of secrecy happening behind the scenes that, allowed or permitted these conspiracy theories to flourish. And an alternative, or I guess one takeaway, is be more transparent. Let's show people how elections are actually being ran. Let's give regular citizens an understanding of how a vote is being counted, so that they're not just creating an idea in their head. people are inherently vulnerable to this. I don't think anyone in the world is not vulnerable to having some crazy theory in their head, you know.
Yeah.
Like it happens all the time. It happens in relationships. Somebody
You
comes
gotta run
home
the
from work late, you know.
You got to run the self-diagnostic, right? Like I'll give you an example. I will cop to like allowing my own cognitive biases to let me kind of run away. So last week, there were people. The Conservative Party of Canada was trending because there was this advertisement that said Justin Trudeau is rigging the election. And I saw that and I was like, oh, hell no. What are you doing? And so because the pump was primed, I'll tell you, I was ready to be like, because I've been watching conservative commentators in Canada in the news propagating these shameful election fraud conspiracies. Right, like the one, like if there were, like if they had a basis in fact at all, I wouldn't be calling them shameful, but I'm calling them shameful on the basis that they just don't have a basis in fact, and the people that are propagating them, I think, understand that, and they're doing it in bad faith. That's why they're shameful. So I'm seeing this happen, right? And then now I see this like conservative advertisement. So I'm right there on Twitter, and I'm posting going like, this is awful. Get this down. This is shameful. Mr. Speaker, shame, Mr. Speaker. When will the Conservative Party of Canada, take this down? And then I was like, okay, run the self-diagnostic here. What am I seeing exactly? And so then I went and I looked into it, and then I was like, oh, this post was from 2 years ago. Okay, still wrong. Okay, still, like a bad faith political move, but existing definitely outside of the current context, and therefore like a different animal. And so like I had already posted stuff on Twitter. So the first thing I did is I said, oh geez, I said some stuff that might not be correct now because now that I realized, so I just deleted those tweets, right? And I made a mistake. I realized that. And so I did something about it. So, I mean, we all are susceptible to it. And the only thing, and I mean, I know we can't rely on people to do it, but if anyone is interested, run the self-diagnostic. In machine learning, they talk about generative adversarial networks. The way you train your neural net is to have a bad guy neural net to beat up your good guy neural net until it becomes a ninja. So run the bad guy neural net in your own mind to beat up whatever idea you have. And if it still survives getting the beating up by the adversarial network, then maybe you're onto something. But if you're not going to do anything to like cross-validate or self-validate or whatever, you're just like making the world worse here. So
I think part of the problem with that though is, especially when it comes to online and misinformation, which I'm not going to try to get into right now, it's time, but a lot of that has to feed into misinformation campaigns and people getting into echo chambers where the ability to do that self-assessment doesn't exist. It just, you're constantly getting fed this narrative, and it just becomes a predominant way of thinking. So it's
I want to
another conversation
that this like unwillingness to do self-diagnostics. It's not about like whether you're like, you don't have to be a professor to do that. In fact, I've seen professors that are falling victim to this like cognitive trap, and they're allowing themselves, because they aren't running the diagnostic, the adversarial thinking that they need to run. And it's actually like, you want to talk about bursting bubbles. It's real. Like, I mean, over the Christmas break, people that I've looked up to, like voices that I've looked up to over the years, realizing like that they just have, that they have been turned to the dark side. They've allowed themselves to be turned to the dark side. And then when you see that, when you see people you've looked up to fall in your eyes, you think to yourself, what is going to save me from that fate? What's going to stop me from becoming cynical like that? I don't know. The only thing I can think of is to run these kind of like, these sort of like critical thinking things, and not let your own specialization like allow you to come up with, like they talk about how smart people actually are in some ways more susceptible to sort of self-radicalization because they can convince themselves, they can find ways to talk themselves into things, So I don't, how do you inoculate yourself against it? The only thing I can think of is like just, critical thinking. Start, like, take whatever you think and just ask yourself, what if I'm wrong? What kind of damage would I be doing to the society right now if I was wrong? Oh, a bunch of damage? Okay, well, I better be right then. So what can I do to like reassure myself that I'm right? Well, maybe I can go and like actually look at the thing. Maybe I can actually go and understand how elections actually work. Maybe I can go ask an election official. Maybe I can go to election conference. Maybe I can go and like email somebody. Like maybe I can
think
email Alex.
If you have a solution for critical thinking or lack thereof, yeah. For being a professor would be the least applicable job you can do. Yeah, no, I think, yeah, I don't know.
I don't know how to solve critical thinking in general, but like with regard to what they call the Kraken, this sort of like body of bad faith election conspiracies that aren't rooted in like any kind of strong like evidence, and unwilling to like, the only thing I can think of about how to deal with this like Kraken stuff is to call it out, to not do it myself, to hold myself to a standard where like hopefully, and and if you ever see me on like TV doing it, that you'll call me out, one day for the 20 years from now, and I'm just like, oh, it's a big fraud, whatever. I don't know what's going to keep me and other people away from it, except to just demand of ourselves that we go back and we critically think, and then when we're wrong, we're not afraid of it. We're not afraid of being wrong.
Well, just think about like the big Microsoft's a good example of this. Closed source was the biggest thing. 90s going into the early 2000s, everything was closed source. Of course, as everything started migrating into cloud environments and open source technology, it's become the de facto principle for software. It's not a panacea or anything like that, but it's open source software, for example, it's
not in the voting world, I'll tell you.
yeah. There are edge cases, but the thing is, people's minds tend to change over time, and as significant security breaches have happened, people have kind of switched their preference. Everyone runs servers on Linux for very particular reasons. It's just inherently more secure, it's more navigatable, it's more malleable to the use cases. And I think elections and voting can be the same thing. There is going to be a switch over, or my hypothesis is there's going to be a switch over now to more transparent systems. People may not, I don't think they want to get into the nitty-gritty of how it's ran, but with the assurances built in that it is being ran effectively now, people's preferences will start changing.
Yeah. So it's like the whole credit card thing. It's like I don't know how it works. I don't know what kind of weird heuristical security methods like the credit card company uses behind the scenes. I just know that they're gonna make it okay. And so voting is a little bit different. It's not like you get a gift certificate when your election gets hacked. There's not really a remedy in a financial sense, but at least having like confidence to know that maybe I don't know how to do it, but I know that the evidence is out there, and that people who are able to spend the time to like learn about it can go and see it. And so I can kind of like rely on them, because by the way, that's already what you do with elections. You already rely on somebody else to check it for you, because you're not there checking it unless you are a volunteer as a scrutineer. And I'm pretty sure most people have never volunteered to scrutinize an election. And by the way, if you want to criticize how elections are run, try working a poll for 12 hours and you might feel differently.
Yeah, I can imagine.
You might have
there's a whole other discussion to be had about what happens, because this has come up in my field, right? What happens when people no longer volunteer, or the average age of a volunteer is like 55 plus or something? What happens when they simply just age out of scrutineers? It's becoming a thing because typically, younger people are just not invested in the process. I mean the volunteering process. So what happens when those people are no longer available? Running a traditional election takes tens of thousands of volunteering and manpower hours. What happens when those aren't available for use anymore?
Well, this is we're seeing this. Yeah, we're seeing this in the United States already after just the malevolence that these these poor election officials, and I mean they are like poor as in like they deserve our sympathy, like because they did, like I mean there's no indication that anybody. Well, I mean there might be like some people. There's not been some kind of as far as we can tell, there's not been a conspiracy. These people have executed their jobs faithfully, impartially, even if the Americans insist on having partisan election officials, like they've acted in a nonpartisan way. They check their partisanality at the doorstep. They're like as they're fond of saying in the United States, we put the country above the party. Just like they've experienced so much hate, and just like that a lot of them are saying, why am I even doing this? They're like, I mean, they're not being paid super well. They're not like. They're not getting like a Netflix deal, they're not getting
it's funny you mentioned that. I saw an election official just within like the last 24 hours leave her job. Yeah. On Twitter. She was just like, I really appreciate it, but I'm moving on to other things. And you can just tell that she was just done. And so, like we want like we already have a recruiting problem with election officials, at least in Canada. It's a hard job. You have to sit like, at least like at a federal Canadian election, you got to sit there for like, I mean, like, I don't know, like maybe like 14, 16 hours. And you can't really go anywhere. You can go to the bathroom a couple times or whatever, but it's a long day. It's a hard day. And most people don't want to do it. I mean, we can't even get half the population to come out and vote. So, like how many people do you think volunteer to be an election like worker or a poll worker or something? Like, what is the reason? Why do they do it? They do it because they recognize the importance of the democratic process. They want to help, but take that like kind of love of country and then pile onto that just like obscene amounts of abuse. The value proposition is no longer there. So now we're going to have like a shortage of qualified people. And who are the people that are going to want to work elections now? It's going to be people that are highly partisan and highly politically motivated, because they're the only people that would be willing to withstand that abuse, because I mean, they're the ones themselves maybe dishing it out, and it becomes like a battle issue more than a democratic issue. What we need is the calm, I like boring, but in like a good way. Librarians of voting,
like just people that can quietly sit there and like they don't show up to the poll. Like you want to talk about nonpartisanality. Like when you show up at a Canadian poll, you have to, like you're a worker, you can't wear blue, red, orange, green. Am I missing any colors? You can't wear those colors, or if you do, they have to be like pastel muted. Right? Because you have to just sort of be this like impartial person, and you just have to sit there and stare at the floor for like, we don't have lineups like they do in the US, because we don't have these monster ballots. So, sometimes there are lineups, but we clear them pretty quickly. So it's you're just sitting there chatting to your colleague or something like that. So it's very boring. But like, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm weird, maybe because I'm into this election stuff, but I like bask in the boringness. I'm just like, I'm just sitting at the poll. When I've worked polls, I'm just like, yeah, breathe it in and let it out. This is democracy working right now. It's very satisfying, at least to me, but it's like, I'm like I say, I'm weird that way. I mean, it's like some people like, like playing video games. I like, volunteering for poll work duty, so.
I love the thing I love about elections and politics my whole life is how in one day the entire country changes. It's just like taking a shower, like you go in, you come out, and it could either be something familiar or something completely different. And that moment of change, I think it's the element of change that really draws me to it, because it does. The countries will take a different shape based on who's in power, and this extends not just at the federal but provincial, municipal level as well. Like, things will happen, and it's not a sole individual. There's counselors, there's parties, etc. But it's just that one element of just a complete reset. You don't typically see that happen in society. Usually an event occurs or something that shocks everyone into a different state of mind. But with politics, it's like a predetermined event where we go in and we emerge, and who knows what we're going to look like on the other side.
I mean, the country doesn't change in that moment. It's more like it's existing in this like superposition of states, and then you just collapse the wave function, and then now it's like it's like it was there, like the outcome was there, existing in a cloud of probabilities, and then you just took the measurement, and then it became real. So
I like this, the idea of quantum elections, Alex.
Yeah. So
let's talk number 2.
So my graduate mentor, David Chom, who is kind of one of the originators, like he and Benelo are sort of like the originators of cryptographic end-to-end verification. And he has this notion of what he calls random sample elections. And so the idea was, well, Matt, like running elections is hard and, whatever. Instead of doing a risk limiting audit on ballots, what if you did a kind of a risk limiting audit as the poll itself, and you picked random people, and so maybe the comparison to risk limiting audits isn't a good one, because there is a ground truth with the risk limiting audit that you can actually get to by counting all of the ballots, right? But what I mean is, like, imagine if you could just take a random sample of the community, and you would have like statistical confidence if the sample was sufficiently and verifiably random of people. You weren't like some partisan politician picking people for their, like a gerrymandering then you could run an election extremely efficiently. You could run an election so efficiently your head would spin, right? Because you would only have to sample maybe 1,000 people, to sort of have a fairly statistically accurate picture. Now, there's a lot of cognitive, barriers there. And so random sample elections for civic elections are maybe not like a good, a proper representation, they're not suitable for civic elections, but they might be suitable in certain non-civic cases where it is just more efficient to like, if you could demonstrate that the sample was random of people, and you could demonstrate that their votes were counted correctly, you could get something that would statistically track the real ground truth of what people thought. Like,
statistically, you're right, but I don't think you could ever seed that statistical group accurately with proper demographical information. Because I'm going down the rabbit hole right now, but right off the bat, people aren't just their limited characteristics. Like, how would you properly statistically align somebody by gender, race, socioeconomic status? There's so many different variables in place that creating a truly unique statistical seed would be almost impossible.
Well, the idea is that it's a random subsample of the general population. If you wanted to get into like cleaving people along identity lines and then sampling them on that basis, then obviously yes. But I mean that kind of departs from the whole one person one vote rule. But like I don't know. I mean, maybe
I don't know, man.
I don't, I'm not into like, I'm not trying to I'm raising the notion of random sample elections just as a kind of like a thought experiment for what things could be like. And that's really what, somebody like Chom has always really been good at, just, kind of coming up with ideas that kind of challenge your thinking and get you to sort of think in a different way. Or if at very least, it just causes you to reaffirm in your own mind what you have. well, oh, like the election is rigged. Oh, everything is like, like it's a bad way to do stuff. And they're like, okay, how about we do it this way? And then everyone says, well, no, we can't possibly do it this way. Well, how about we do it this other way? Oh, no, we can't possibly do it that way. And then you go in a big circle and you come back to the beginning, except now you actually feel like, you feel like a renewed sense of confidence in how things are done. I mean, there's not really a better way to do it. I mean, like there's all kinds of interesting proposals. All the blockchain bros, they like this thing called liquid democracy, where you're given the entitlement to vote on like every single issue, and that vote fraction, you're allowed to delegate to like a voting influencer if you want to. You can cast it on your own, or you can say, you know what, I know a lot about like old vacuum tube radios, but I don't know a lot about like fixing cars. So if they're going to make legislations about cars, I could delegate my votes to my like favorite, like my favorite YouTube mechanic or something like that. Like, and so, there's a lot of interesting kind of like discussion there, but you start running into, I can't seem to get this plant to not do that. You get into some, so like some interesting questions about, like the whole, just like the whole democratic principles. And, maybe we could save that for a future conversation about like what the real problem is with blockchain voting,
Yeah, there we go. There's topic number 2.
Whole other conversation. Yeah. So, although, well, we're, I think we're getting close to like, where I think we're over almost 3.5 hours in here. So maybe this is a good point to
end it. Yeah, I think so. We famously, just for anyone, so whoever, if you've made it this far, I again applaud you. The first time Alex and I sat down thoroughly to speak about election security and everything, we had a 7-hour uninterrupted meeting with no bathroom break, water break, anything. And it was only when we had to pick up our respective children to school when we realized that the time to conclude the meeting should end. So
you came to Western Campus to sort of to just because we had talked at eVote ID and we sort of realized that we were basically like sort of living down the 401 from one another, and so you came to visit campus, and we kind of talked about sort of like what you were working on at the time, and yeah, I think we sat for 7 hours straight, just talked,
Yeah. It was like when breaking the seal when you're drinking. We didn't realize how long it was or how bad it was until we stood up and we're like, oh yeah, wow, like that was. I mean,
and like there's just like there's so much to talk about, which is why we got to bring it online. And honestly, I don't even know if anybody's even going to watch this. So
if anyone watches 3.5 hours, you can contact me. And
people watch 3.5 hours on Joe Rogan all the time, right? I mean,
yeah.
But just they're talking about bow hunting and smoking meats and so forth. I kind of put it out there from time to time that like Joe really needs to get somebody on to talk about like elections and about the election conspiracies and about how the elections are counted and whatnot. And
he's talked about it a bit, but I think it's been in individual talks recently. But yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. So I mean, I would love to see 3.5 hours devoted to that. And because we haven't seen it, we have to be the change we want to see in the world.
Yeah. If anyone enjoyed it, I hope you did. It was a pleasure talking to you, Alex. It's always good to touch base and get our respective opinions on everything.
Yeah. Likewise, Matthew. And let's do it again sometime.
Yeah. Have a great day.
Okay. See you.